Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoy this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience.
The girl tried to cover her face with her hands. Around her classmates were running around her and pulling her hair. Ugly. Ben Swan shouted at the top of his lungs. Look at her. Elephant ears. Anne didn't even cry. She was used to being bullied by her classmates. She knew that if she stood still, they would quickly calm down and let her go. That's what happened that time. After about 5 minutes, the excitement disappeared. The girl quickly took her bag and ran towards the house. But when she ran 10 meters, a stone hit her in the back. Ah, she cried out and turned round. Behind her, Ben was laughing at the top of his lungs. The girl cried. Time passed, and the boy's hatred seemed to fade. But her classmates seemed to go mad. Anne had always had a reputation for being the ugliest girl in the class. And then the real miracles began to happen. She became not just a teenager, but a real beauty. Her gorgeous thick hair covered her big ears, her huge nose seemed to shrink, and Anne's unusually beautiful eyes came to the fore. The girls in her class, sensing great competition, tried their best to uphold a long-standing tradition. What a freak, they whispered behind her. How could the earth be so ugly? By graduation, life had put everything in its place, and the ugly duckling, her beauty, overshadowed all the written beauties of the school. But by the end of her studies, Anne had already formed such a low self-esteem that she could not develop confidence in herself because of her appearance. The girl's parents were ordinary laborers, and they simply had neither the physical strength nor such looks to help their daughter in any way. On the contrary, Anne in their eyes was a girl of modesty, and this was very much appreciated in the society in which they lived. The only thing that saved our heroine was studying. Since she had neither girlfriends nor friends, she devoted all her time to lessons, so that the only student for many years held in her hands a gold medal and dreamed of institute. However, Anne entered the university easily. There were no problems in passing the exams. The examiner even joked at her. I feel that a new luminary of science awaits us, perhaps. He shook the student's hand after the exams were over. And so the small town was left behind. How Anne wished then that her complexes were in the past. But no, she brought them all to the University of Florida, which greatly complicated the girl's life. It's been 17 years. Anne, please look at this document, asked the chief. The woman adjusted her large glasses and began to carefully read every word. What do you think? He exclaimed, folding his arms across his chest. I don't like their condition, she scratched her head. It's a lot to take on. I wouldn't risk it, Anne concluded. Neither would I. We don't know what they'll do with our equipment. Maybe they'll break something on purpose, sighed the director. And I don't like all these non-standard contracts. There are time-tested documents. Why reinvent the wheel? Exactly, because they want to hide something from us, Anne said sadly. Mr. Jason, let's check them out, have another meeting, and then, as they say, either kick them up the arse or hug them. Let's do it. He agreed and walked out of his deputy's office. He kept wiping his sweaty face from the exertion. Anne sighed. She had worked with Mr. Jason for years. She'd come to him from the institute, in fact, and over the years she'd worked hard to grow into a good position. She still had some grasp of other people's psychology, but she had a good grasp of her own. Miami was burning hot. It was the most unbearable heat. Neither fans nor air conditioning could help. Anne put a bottle of ice on her forehead. It always worked for her. Even her head felt like it was going to boil. She sighed, fixed her wedding ring on her finger. Something had to be done. Again, the painful question appeared in her mind. I'm indulging him myself. And what's the result? Anne wondered. What's changed in the last few years? Nothing. How long can you lie on the sofa without working? I don't believe in his illness anymore. Why do others get better, but he doesn't? Anne drove home in a low mood. Every day it seemed to her more and more that her marriage had been a mistake. As soon as the girl began her university studies, her life changed dramatically. Anne's parents did not have so much money to rent her a separate accommodation, so she, like many other students, was lucky she was given a place in the dormitory. But for Anne, it was a real stress. The reserved girl found herself in a room with two other, more open and cheerful students. Friendship between them did not develop, but they lived, in general, not bad. Almost the whole first year, Anne suffered from insomnia. She'd never lived so close to anyone before. And she had her own room at home, and here she was sharing her life with strangers. But her passion for her studies overcame the awkwardness, and Anne concentrated on her studies. In her 5th year, Anne was hired by an industrial equipment company. Before enrolling, Anne never had any doubts that she needed to graduate in engineering. The girl saw great prospects in this field, so from the very first day of her work experience, Anne began to work hard for a better future. And in 3 years, she had already become a leading employee. She was able to take out a flat on credit. It seemed that life had improved. The salary was good. Every now and then she was praised by the general manager. And in 2 years, a new miracle happened. For health reasons, the last director left and strongly recommended to appoint Anne as a director. So, in her almost 30s, Anne was already working as a general manager, and for the next couple of years, she was able to pay off her loan in full and buy herself a car. When she first came to work, the company was headed by Mr. Jason's father, but he soon died suddenly, and the young man took all the responsibility on himself. At first, all the employees were afraid that he would fail. But no. The young man proved to be quite resilient and competent to take his father's company to the next level. I wish it would rain. Anne walked out of the office building. I can't take it anymore. She was originally from the South herself, but the localized climate at Miami had made the city unbearable in the summer. Truth be told, despite the proximity of the ocean, they didn't get out to it that often on weekends. Usually Anne would pick up some paperwork and do something at home. I don't want anything the woman exhaled, but she was well aware that she still had to stop at the shop. Michael hadn't been out of bed for the last month. At first, Anne was very worried about her husband, but then she began to notice the blush on his face. She had various thoughts in her head, but being busy at work and her mother-in-law, although not often, but interfered in their lives. Anne felt as if she were in charge of her husband. Michael was more like her appendage than a separate being. The lack of friends also made things much worse. Anne didn't really have anyone to talk to. Her parents weren't really interested in her affairs. She helped them buy a nice house, so they just lived their lives, and Anne seemed to have everything. She eventually sold her 1-bedroom flat, and just before she met Michael, decided to invest the money and bought a 2-bedroom flat. But here is a family happiness to her never came, although everything started so beautifully. In his 32, Anne finally met him. Or rather, Michael himself approached her. Anne had seen him a couple of times at work. He was the office supplies manager. Michael read the sign that said this office was the office of the chief engineer. Knocking, he was invited in by Mrs. Anne. A Hollywood smile flooded the guest's face. "I'm here to see you. Last time you ordered something, but we didn't have that model then. Can I offer you something in return?" Quickly, he took a huge catalog out of the bag and began to leaf through it. Anne was concentrating on her work and couldn't understand what he wanted from her. "What do you think of this shelving unit?" Michael poked his finger and chose the more expensive options. "It will look great in your interior." The guest was so confused that the general manager poked at the first option and closed the catalog. "A very good choice," Michael said with a smile. "By the way," he glanced at the woman's hands, "I hope you won't mind if I send you a present from me personally." No, Anne didn't take his words to heart. She stared at her papers again. The working day was almost over when there was another knock on Anne's door. She asked to come in. A courier stood in front of her, holding a gorgeous bouquet. She looked at him in bewilderment. "These are for you." The man handed her the flowers. "Please sign." There was a note in the bouquet to the most beautiful woman in the world, she read. "I can't make any sense of it. Maybe someone mixed it up." But the piece of paper definitely had an address and her last name on it. She set the flowers down and concentrated on her work again. Several times she lifted her glasses and wondered who it could be. Anne didn't take the roses home. She safely forgot about them as soon as she grabbed her coat. 3 days later, Michael reappeared in the office. He brought the ordered furniture. He went to see the general manager again. "I hope you like the flowers," he said shyly. "I really wanted to make you happy." "Oh, it was you?" Surprised woman. "Thank you, yes. The flowers were excellent." And yet the next day Anne remembered the flowers and took the roses home. "I realize this may seem indecent of me," the man blushed. "But I'd really like to invite you to dinner," Michael said. Anne blushed too. "I don't even know," she replied simply. "I have so much work to do." "But you can do it once." He pressed her a little. "Please, just one evening." And Anne agreed. Of course, she often traveled to business meetings, restaurants, and clients, but she still had no personal life. In principle, the woman had made her peace with that, and Michael was charming. Every now and then he praised Anne and everything she did. The compliments poured in, making the woman feel uncomfortable. Something in her heart twitched. A strong desire to have a family and indeed to love and be loved by someone rose to the surface. Her beloved man looked after her in such a way that it seemed that there was no better man in the whole world. Romance, live concerts, long walks. Anne had given up. For the first time in her life, she let go of her inner tension and fell in love. It's safe to say she was happy then. "Marry me," Michael asked her one day. "Anne, I love you. You're my woman." After this proposal was immediately met with the man's mother. She turned out to be a real angel. Mrs. Caroline kept echoing her son's sentiments. How extraordinary Anne is. The lack of experience of close contact with people did its job, and Anne completely trusted her fiancé and his mother. The wedding was not too pompous, although there were plenty of guests present. And somehow it happened from the beginning that Michael moved into his wife's flat. They wouldn't have been able to live at his mother's place in a one-bedroom anyway. And it all seemed so logical. That's how the family life of our heroine began. It should be emphasized once again that the lack of serious relationships Anne with the opposite sex drew in her imagination great love, for which she was ready to go to the edge of the world. Not immediately, but the woman began to notice that her husband is somehow not quite like the one she imagined. A year after the wedding, Michael quit his job. Then he spent almost a year interviewing for a job, but he never found a decent position. "Michael, well, you have a good experience of working with people," his wife Anne advised him. "Just start small. I'm sure in a couple of months you'll be noticed and promoted." "I'm sick and tired of being on the dole," he said angrily. "I can't understand what they want from me. But how can they offer me 30 to 40,000 with my skills? You're being paid 150. "Michael," Anne said, "but I'm deputy director now. I have so much responsibility that I'm in charge of all the processes in our company." "And you think I had no responsibility in my office? My husband wouldn't give up. No, I've had enough. Either let them pay me at least 60 to 70, or..." He stopped talking. "But not every company will pay a deputy like me 155. I know small offices where the deputy director gets 50. It depends on the size of the company." As much as Anne wanted to help Michael, she couldn't. She had no idea that her husband's arrogance had not come from nothing. "Son, you're so lucky to have her." My darling Mrs. Caroline nodded. "Where else would she find such a man? You don't drink, you don't smoke, you don't look at other women. You've got to fulfill yourself, haven't you? While you're looking for a decent job, let Anne support you. It's normal," she stressed the last word, "if she's so lucky in life. Though who knows how she got to be the deputy?" She said quietly, so that her son wouldn't hear her. Mrs. Caroline did not stoop to primitive insults, but she always spoke plainly. So from the outside she looked like a woman of wisdom who should have listened. Michael, you could say, was a fan of his mother. If he had been asked to name a woman who embodied the feminine ideal, he would have called her name without hesitation. "I feel bad for Anne sometimes," Michael admitted honestly. "After all, she does work weekends." "Michael, times have changed," Mrs. Caroline replied. "Who says a man has to support a woman?" She raised an eyebrow. "And there's no telling what kind of job you'll get. Let's say you're offered a deputy or even a director's position. You have experience, and you know how to communicate with people. And then what do you get? If you get a higher salary, Anne has to feel uncomfortable. That's not the way it works. His mother's arguments seemed reasonable to him. In fact, she was the one who had steered his son in the right direction, so to speak. When Michael told her that he liked a woman who was doing well in life, Mrs. Caroline, in her manner, as if by accident, advised him to look at this Anne. Mrs. Caroline was well aware of her son's worthlessness. She was determined to do everything she could to marry him to Anne. She had a 3-room flat and a huge salary by her standards. Who would want her inactive son? No matter how hard Michael's mother tried, he grew up as an uninitiative guy. He struggled to graduate from college. Twice Mrs. Caroline almost married him off, of course, to girls with a better position. But nobody wanted to look at Michael. So it was his mother, not he, who was behind all the courtship of Anne. She outlined the program point by point, how he should behave, what to talk about, how to dress. From Michael's descriptions, his mother quickly realized that Anne was a common gray mouse, so she had no doubt that she could easily handle her. Somehow, Mrs. Caroline insisted that Michael keep his job for another year. They were going to sack him for irresponsibility, but the woman talked to the director and cried that they needed money for medication. In general, with a bit of grief, Michael was left for another year. At the beginning of the 3rd year of married life, in order not to inflame the situation, he finally accepted the offer of one enterprise. And Anne was happy in a way, too. "My son is a businessman," Mrs. Caroline said proudly. "He opened a huge bakery, and for the first 6 months everything seemed to be going well. But then, in a flash." "What happened?" Anne ran up to Michael. "When he came home late one night, they made me sign the papers," he said through tears. In her husband's version, the competitors hired thugs and took the bakery away from him. In reality, of course, it was the other way round. Michael, as they say, failed in his elementary duties. In his life, he never had assistants who would knead dough and bake pies for free. Because of his laziness and slackness, he blew it all. 2 weeks after this terrible event, Michael became seriously ill. Again, on his mother's advice. Anne's mind was reeling. Not only had she lost the money she had worked so hard to earn, but now her husband was ill with some rare, incurable disease. "Anne, don't worry," Michael groaned. "Mom will take care of me." Secretly from Anne, Michael wrote a power of attorney for his car, which, incidentally, also bought him a wife. And it wasn't cheap, so now there was an excuse to make it look like Mrs. Caroline had to take care of her son. As far as Anne knew, she was working, but according to her mother-in-law, they let her go when she needed to. Anne was under stress. Her hands shook as she read the doctor's report. "What does it mean?" she asked her mother-in-law. "Is it treatable? Should we go to New York or Los Angeles?" There's no point," Mrs. Caroline sighed. "Anne, he needs a rest. He's exhausted himself because of this business of his." She wept. "My boy has worked so hard for you." Anne felt a hidden reproach. The wife certainly felt some resentment towards Michael, just throwing away $1 million, but now she was ashamed of it. "Don't worry, I'll take care of his treatment myself," said the mother-in-law. "Only the doctor prescribed expensive medication," mother-in-law said carefully. "I'll transfer the money to Michael's card. You can spend as much as you need." "Thank you, darling," Mrs. Caroline hugged her and sobbed. "I have a golden daughter-in-law. How lucky my son is. I'm so grateful to you for not abandoning Michael in his hour of need." To be honest, Mrs. Caroline had been frightened out of her wits when her worthless Michael had lost his pie shop. The woman realized that if some tragic event wasn't introduced now, she might drop him. And to lose such a feeding ground would be a complete folly for both of them. So Michael developed a rare autoimmune disease, naturally incurable. "Mum, I can't stay in bed all the time." Michael sighed. "Are you having a crisis?" she said. "When you go into remission, you'll feel better. So there will be times when you'll be lying down, but most of the time you'll be able to drive your car, go for walks. Are you sick? Be thankful you have such a wonderful wife." Anne did go to the doctor who supposedly treated her husband. He confirmed the diagnosis on the certificate. It didn't even occur to the woman that he'd just been paid off. If she had made Michael retake the tests with another doctor, then everything would have been clarified. But she was used to trusting her husband. and she would never have thought of such perfidy. Anne was secretive, but she was generally good with people. Anne got out of the car and headed for her driveway. She stopped at the shop and bought 2 bags of groceries. It was mostly ready-to-eat or convenience foods. Because of her stressful job, Anne was woefully short of time to do household chores. Mr. Jason had made her not just a deputy, but an assistant, a consultant, and a friend in one person. This, of course, put additional responsibilities on the woman, but basically the chief was the only person she could be friends with. There were never any games or lies between them. They both told each other the truth. She was very comfortable in Mr. Jason's company. In short, she would not hesitate to go on a scouting mission with him if it was offered to her. She opened the door to the flat and immediately heard a groan. She so wished she could have stayed in silence, but her husband's illness was adding to her already frayed nerves. Hi, she smiled, staring intently into Michael's face. For almost a week she couldn't control herself. Whenever she saw her husband, for some reason she paid attention to the color of his skin. To her surprise, his skin was pink and looked like a normal, healthy person. "How are you feeling?" she asked the traditional question. "Are you hungry?" "No, my mum left a while ago. She fed me," her husband said faintly. "She went to the doctor. He said that in a week or so I should feel better and I should be able to go out." "All right," she smiled wryly. "Then I'll go to work. I have to." "I guess it's my fault," Anne thought, chewing on a cutlet. "I wanted a family so badly, but I didn't realize it wasn't just for one night. I have a job. I can't devote as much time to Michael as he wants. Otherwise, who would work?" Lately, Anne had even started watching programs. She wanted to know how other spouses lived, what they did. "I feel like there's something wrong with me," Anne sighed. "Maybe family is just not my thing. There are women who stay alone for the rest of their lives." Anne had never thought about children. Or rather, she was insanely afraid of this question. "Maybe I should see a psychologist?" A thought flashed through her head. "I won't be able to do that for so long." She covered her face with her hands, tears welling up involuntarily. She rarely felt sorry for herself. She was used to suppressing negative feelings or forbidding herself from feeling them. The next day, during her lunch break, the woman made an appointment with a specialist. End of the working day. Anne was looking forward to it on the one hand, but on the other she was apprehensive. She took a deep breath, knocked on the door, and was invited in. In front of her was a man in his 50s. He smiled radiantly. Anne was touched by the fact that his smile was genuine. She could feel it. "I wish I could swim in the sea right now. I can feel with my skin how cool the water is," said the psychologist cheerfully. "I am so attracted to the open space. I like the forest more." Anne joined the conversation. "There you can hide from prying eyes." "Do you think someone is following you?" The man asked a provocative question. "Sometimes I do," she admitted honestly. "I feel that I always have to be on guard. It's the only way I can be safe." "And how would you describe this danger?" he asked cautiously. "You could use adjectives like slippery, cold, terrifying." The guest hesitated. She had never gone so deep inside herself, and immediately she felt fear. "I would say danger is someplace where I feel bad, where I feel intense fear." "Is that where something is going to happen to you?" The psychologist asked a leading question. "Can you visualize this event?" "I just feel that something could happen, and I would suffer a lot," she sighed. "Are you happy now?" The man asked the unexpected question. "Just the very fact that I have you says that you are not. You are already suffering." Anne's lips quivered and tears flowed from her eyes. The psychologist waited silently for her to release her emotions. "I feel a constant inner tension. It's wearing me out," she whispered. "My husband is seriously ill and I don't know what to do about it." "Are you worried that your husband will die?" the man asked. "Do you feel that you are responsible for his life?" No, the patient shook her head negatively. "What's the right way to put it?" Anne wondered. "I'm afraid of being bad. Sometimes I think I can't stand it and imagine leaving my husband. I feel so ashamed." "Why do you think that if you don't have the strength to look after him, you must be bad? And anyway, who determines whether a person is bad or good?" But it is understandable, the people around us, said the woman. And she was struck by the answer. God, it turns out that I am with my husband not because I love him, but because I want to be good in other people's eyes. In whose eyes exactly? The psychologist kept his eyes on her. Can you name specific people? Yes, my parents, my husband's mother, he himself. She looked at the man pleadingly, especially the last two. Would you say that your husband and his mother define what you should be? The psychologist concluded. Do you understand? Anne clenched her fingers nervously. As a child, I was constantly laughed at by my classmates, and I didn't think I could ever get married. I never had any friends. Tears came out of her eyes again. So you're saying that because your husband paid attention to you, you're willing to serve him. You were bad in your own eyes. How else do you explain being laughed at? He hurt her feelings. And when someone paid attention to you, were you willing to be anything to avoid feeling humiliated and guilty again? Anne took a break. Went outside. Her hands were shaking. She couldn't seem to hide anything from the psychologist. He could see right through her. 10 minutes later, Anne came back. I've decided that I'd rather be hurt now, but I'd rather be free of this burden once and for all, she said. Anne, why were you bullied by your classmates? The doctor suddenly plunged a knife into her heart. I was ugly as a child, she sobbed. That's why everyone laughed at me. Which girl in your class was the prettiest, please? The man kept his eyes on her. I don't know, she answered timidly. I never thought about it. I thought many of my classmates looked like me. Catherine had ears as big as mine. Elizabeth was very thin. If I told you now that you were no different from any other girl, how would you feel now? Mr. Jason asked. As if there had never been all that mockery of me, Anne answered suddenly. It was just a dream. Exactly. You were never an ugly girl. Can you understand that? Ugliness is so rare. What is it when a child has 11 fingers instead of 10, or one body and two heads like Siamese twins? Everything else is normal. Think of your worst abuser. And now from your current level, tell me, was he or she beautiful? No. Anne immediately thought of Ben Swan, the bully in her class. He even had a nasty look on his face. After the first session, Anne had a real revolution. It was funny to her how she could react to her classmates like that, because it was her reaction that determined everything. If she, as a child, had not believed that she was ugly, they would have all quickly moved away from her. With Michael, the situation was similar. It was just that now she was on the opposite side. After all, he had convinced her that she was the most beautiful woman in the world. Naturally, it was more pleasant to be on this side than as a child, with constant humiliation. Neither of these things will make me happy, Anne whispered as she stopped the car outside the house. I just agreed to marry Michael because he covered my complexes, and I was willing to pay for it. God. I was willing to pay for being treated well and loved. The woman was so scared of feeling powerless again, like when she was a child. So she saw Michael as a guarantee that it would never happen to her again. And if there's a demand, there's always a supply. Nothing new. Anne's request had been heard, and Michael was exactly what she needed. The truth caused a lot of pain, but the woman decided she'd had enough. She was tired of playing the role of the perfect wife. Besides, she felt that everything in her life was one-sided. Anyone would have noticed that from the outside. She walked resolutely into the flat. She decided to distance herself from her husband's illness and be more cold-blooded about the whole situation. Anne, you've come already, said Miss Caroline. Mom said I need to pay the insurance for my car. The wife was silent. Michael looked at her in bewilderment. Anne? He looked into her face and said. Anne was glowing. Since Mrs. Caroline is driving it now, I think she can pay for it, she said calmly. Her husband almost jumped out of bed. Anne noticed the impulse. There was a look of bewilderment in his eyes. I'm already spending almost all the money on your treatment, Anne exclaimed. Let your mother do something to help, she said calmly. The man was not prepared for such a development. He didn't even know what to say to her. I will continue my work with the psychologist. Anne said to herself, "Stop writing me. I've never been in anyone's debt, there's nothing wrong with me." And Michael lay there in pain. He'd promised his mother he'd wire her the insurance money tonight. The money Anne had sent for his medication, his mother had already withdrawn and hidden. "Michael, what's up?" She called him tomorrow morning. "I need to drop off the paperwork." "Mum, she won't give me the insurance money," her son whispered quietly to her. What Mrs. Caroline snapped out of her role. Is she out of her mind? The mother-in-law was outraged. "Oh, I didn't like my daughter-in-law's answer. All these years I've been courting her, and now this." "Well, I'll arrange for you." She was angry. "If you don't want to be nice, I'll take more money from you." Naturally, Mrs. Caroline could do nothing. She just polluted the air with her profanity. But somehow the woman was sure that she would find a way out of Anne. At the second session, Anne realized even more that something was wrong in her relationship with her husband. "Why don't you have children?" The psychologist asked the question head-on. It's fear, he glared at the patient. "Yes," she said confidently. "I'm afraid that I won't be able to cope with motherhood and that I'll be judged." "Anne, you have to look at your motivation, that is, what has driven you so far," the doctor said seriously. "It hurts me to be humiliated," she replied immediately. "So you've been driven by fear?" "Yes. But that's not all." Anne reflected. She looked at her life, but could only find a constant struggle for her psychological comfort. "The second is much harder to see." The psychologist understood her confusion. "Your second motivation was to do anything to avoid being yourself." He drew a stunning conclusion. "After all, from your childhood experience it turned out that if you are as you are, then you will surely be punished for it. And since you couldn't change the shape of your ears or shorten your nose, it seemed that you were doomed to humiliation. Being yourself was bad, it was dangerous." Something came up to Anne's throat and she cried. The psychologist had made it clear to her that this was so. The woman had always been afraid of herself. It seemed to her that the true Anne was somehow unseemly. She didn't live up to the standards set. And if she became herself again, she would suffer so much that she might die of pain. That's a lie. The psychologist brought her back to reality. Only when you are yourself will you find true happiness. It is all these imposed roles that create suffering in your life. You must have the courage to look at the Anne you have inside you. There is no other way. Perhaps Anne could have said it was the most important day of her life. But there was a real revolution in her mind from the mere idea that she wasn't real now. Her fear receded. So Anne decided, no matter what, to only move forward. On the way home, a strange thought popped into her head. She turned the car around and drove towards a medical center. Anne had been there a couple of times before. "Would you go tomorrow at 11 o'clock? The nurse asked her. "We will come with the doctor because we have to take blood for a test." Why Anne had decided not to warn Michael, she didn't know. It was just her intuition that told her to do it that way. "I don't want him to get nervous early," the woman made up a reason for herself. She was a little embarrassed that her husband wasn't talking to her. Perhaps earlier she would have liked to know why, but then she somehow just took it all in stride. The next morning she went into the chief's office to excuse herself for an hour. Mr. Jason was sitting there with a sad face. "Did something happen to you?" she asked fearfully. "Are you pale? Do you have blood pressure?" "No," he sighed. "It's just a family emergency, but it'll pass." He tried to smile. Mr. Jason was going to celebrate his 45th birthday this year, but things hadn't worked out. The children had grown up and moved into their own flat, bought by their father. And with his wife, they lived like strangers. "I'm tired," Mr. Jason admitted. "You know, sometimes I think about selling the business. I can't take it anymore." "I understand." The woman sat down on the table. "You and I are like two squirrels in a wheel. We're going to get kicked out of it someday. The only question is whether we'll be alive afterwards." "I don't know," he said seriously. "Anne, why do I need all this? I've got everything I need. I want a peaceful old age." "You are still young," smiled the assistant. "The midlife crisis ages us all. You and I live in such a beautiful place, but we don't have time to go to the ocean, he sighed. Mr. Jason, I need an hour with my husband. The doctor has to be here, Anne asked. The man waved his hand. He trusted his deputy like he trusted himself. He'd never had a problem with Anne. Is there any point in trying to keep the family together if I discussed her? Mr. Jason reasoned. Lucy had already fulfilled her every whim, and now she was no longer interested in me. His wife's coldness had become annoying of late. People always think that lack of money is the only problem for scandals in a family. But Mr. Jason could say with complete certainty that it didn't make any difference. You can be loved for money. But when you get so much of it that a person stops hiding their sincere intentions from you, that's the end of it. Lucy, Mr. Jason's wife, was no longer afraid of losing him. It seemed to him that she was even deliberately doing everything she could to make him the first to offer her a divorce. That way the woman could get a great deal of money. And considering the fact that Lucy had never worked, it still wasn't fair in her husband's eyes. Of course, he wasn't going to leave her penniless, but to give away half of the business, just like that, was a real sacrilege. All right, he sighed. As long as it lasted, as long as it lasted. We'll see about that. Anne glanced nervously at her watch. She was due home at 10:45. Mrs. Caroline, according to Michael, usually visited him at an hour or two when she brought him a fresh lunch. She opened the flat door, entered quietly, peered into her husband's room and froze. The bed was empty. Anne went through all the rooms, but Michael wasn't home. So Anne decided to call him. Michael, hello, she took an air and tried to say each word calmly. How are you? What are you doing? Hi, he said quietly. Anne, what can I do? I've been lying around all day. I can't even get to the loo. Mom should be here soon. There was a click, and the door opened. My husband Michael appeared in the corridor. He almost fell through the floor when he saw Anne. I went to the drugstore. I didn't want to upset you, he mumbled in his defense. I could barely make it back. Get down. The wife ordered him to lie down. The doctor is coming to examine you. Why? Michael asked Anne a strange question. The doctor just came the other day. Well, as they say, trust but verify, she said angrily. Come on, they'll be here in a minute. I'm not going to see another doctor. Michael got angry and sat down on the couch. If you don't trust me, say so. He began to use a clever trick. That's it. Anne screamed. Her husband has never seen her so angry. Do you think you found a fool? That's it, I've had enough. Or you stop this comedy. She rushed into the corridor and ran out of the flat. Oh shit, Michael cursed at himself. Why did I go to the shop, you idiot? What's going to happen now? He dialed his mother's number. Anne drove to work and sobbed. She hated everyone, especially herself. She had to be so stupid. Divorce him, she said to herself. Let the dependent get out of my flat. A bloody Alfonso. That's it, I've had enough. She closed herself in her office and there was a knock. She didn't open the door right away. The chief came in. Anne, what are you doing? He was frightened. Anne. He ran for cold water. Mr. Jason, how can you be such an idiot? She stammered. He played a trick on me. He was never sick, do you understand? He just didn't want to work, and he thought I'd just keep feeding him. So the man scratched his head. This is all very familiar to me. Get your things, he ordered and grabbed her arm. Mr. Jason deftly fitted himself into the rows of cars. 40 minutes later, they pulled onto the open motorway. On the way, the chief stopped to buy cold water and something to eat. The two of them sat on a deserted beach. Mr. Jason knew a couple of good places like that, silent and staring off into the distance. You could tell that both the man and the woman were experiencing the same thing. I told her first, the chief turned to Anne. I can't take it anymore. I come home and she turns her nose up at me. I'm sick of it. At first I was ashamed in front of the kids, but they're grown up and have their own lives. I'm going to file for divorce too. Mr. Jason, how could you use me like that? The assistant whispered. I'm not made of iron. Somehow he's convinced he's the only one who needs me. What's wrong with me? She looked at the man. She looked at the man. Anne, yes, all this is nonsense, he smiled. This I say to you as a representative of the stronger sex. As for me, you should be chased by a crowd of men. Do you want me to prove it to you tonight? You'll be fighting off your admirers. You owe me a nice dress and loose hair. Where are we going? She asked Jason hesitantly. I don't know, Anne. But you've known me for days, he stroked her head. How could I get you into anything bad? No, she shook her head negatively. All right then, I accept your challenge. She rose to her feet. Stop being a whiner. If I want to be happy, I have to do it myself. It was about 7 o'clock. When they got back to the office, she got into her car. They'd arranged for Mr. Jason to pick her up at 9. She didn't even pay any attention to her husband. Quickly, she went into her room, locked herself in, pulled out her prettiest dress, put on her eyelashes, unraveled her ponytail. She heard her mother-in-law's voice behind her back. We need to talk, she said in a commanding voice. Anne said nothing to her and left the flat. Mrs. Caroline stared at her in bewilderment. Where is she going? The mother asked her son Michael, who came up to her. I don't understand. Meanwhile, Anne jumped into the car with the chief. He smiled. Let's go, shall we? He laughed. I hope you're not going to leave me, Mr. Jason. What if someone comes on to me? The woman was afraid. You're not alone. Your beau will be sitting nearby. He pointed his finger at himself. Anne laughed merrily. She had seldom experienced such a state of lightness and joy. Well then, let's get on with the adventure. The passenger commanded, and the car started. They stopped outside a decent club. Mr. Jason knew that it was a respectable men's club, so it wasn't the sort of place where fighting or brawling was part of the program. Come out, he said, giving his lady a hand. You had a husband, and now you are completely free. So put a smile on your face. It was Anne's first time in a place like this. She raised her head high and seemed to swim to the table. Mr. Jason deliberately sat down at another. No sooner had Anne looked at the menu than a waiter approached her. He was holding a bottle of wine. This is for you from that gentleman over there. The guy gently showed his hand, along with wishes for a good evening. Anne, like a lady of the world, inclined her head in agreement, turned round and looked at the chief. He was smiling at her with his arms crossed over his chest. Mr. Jason was absolutely right. About 10 people had met her today. You are simply irresistible. An older man said to her, Shall we play roulette? A lady like that must love gambling. Unfortunately, I am an exception to the rule, she smiled. Besides, my man should be here soon. All in all, in an hour, Anne was even tired. She was not used to such attention from men. The chief noticed her uneasiness and sat down beside her. I counted 11, he said cheerfully. Well, shall we dance now? He held out his hand to her. Anne was afraid to tell him that she had never danced in her life. But Mr. Jason quickly put his arm round her waist and led the way. Mr. Jason, you've opened up a whole new world for me. She couldn't catch her breath when they returned to the table. But this place is more for flings, he admitted. But that doesn't change anything. Oh, you. Anne wanted to tell him, but she laughed out loud. That's why they come to me so easily. But I couldn't tell you that, said the chief seriously. Otherwise you would never have agreed. The night brought a little chill, and the colleagues walked along the deserted street. I love it when the crickets sing, Mr. Jason said. You know, it's been a long time since I've had a rest. Thank you, Lord. It's like I've lost 10 years, he said. You know, I don't want to lie. I don't want to go home, she said. My husband is the past of my life. I feel the same way now. Anne, we have to move on, he stopped in front of her. Our fixation on all these standards. Oh my God. It's like I've just woken up from a long sleep, Anne whispered. What have I done to myself? I've hated myself all this time. It was about 3 o'clock when Mr. Jason stopped the car outside her house. They were silent for a while. Neither of them wanted to break the magic silence. "See you tonight," he said quietly. "Until today," she repeated. The principal watched her swim towards the driveway. Anne's luxurious hair fluttered in the wind. "A stunning woman," he sighed. "Why hadn't we met before?" Michael sat in the corridor, leaning against the wall, asleep. He never waited for his wife to return. She hadn't returned his calls. Anne shamelessly stepped over him and locked herself in her room. She didn't care. The divorce issue had been settled. Now it was only a matter of time for Anne. She had no interest in Michael and what would happen to him now. She got up early on purpose. It wasn't even 7 o'clock. Anne dressed quickly. She didn't want to see her husband. He was still lying in the corridor. He opened his eyes abruptly, rushed to his wife's room, but it was closed. Did she not sleep at home tonight? He thought in horror. God, what's happening to her? He rang his mother, who promised to come soon. Mrs. Caroline was very nervous about her daughter-in-law. She really didn't like the whole story. God forbid she should find someone else, she said, pacing up and down the room. Michael, how could you do this to me? I told you to lie down. You should be up and about by next week. She won't even talk to me, the son said through his tears. So is Mum going to be with me now? If she... There will be no divorce? She threw angrily at him. Nobody needs your Anne but you. Maybe she just couldn't take it, found herself a man for the evening. No one's going to have a serious relationship with her. Have you seen the glasses she wears? She's a skank, for God's sake. How can you even sleep in the same bed with her? Mrs. Caroline was deliberately exaggerating Anne's shortcomings. She didn't know that last night her daughter-in-law had shown her beauty to the full. And if only she'd given a reason, someone would have hit on her. Mum, talk to her. Michael begged. I can't do this without her. I love her. Tell her you love her money, she said angrily. All right, I'll stay with you tonight. Otherwise, I won't catch her. Anne was almost asleep by her computer when the chief came in and put a mug of strong coffee in front of her. How are you? He asked her thoughtfully. Anne, I was up almost all night, as if in some kind of euphoria. But I can't open my eyes now, Mr. Jason smiled. I'm starving, she whispered, resting her head on the table. Come on, get up, said the headmaster. Let's go to lunch. I'm starving myself. They dragged themselves to the car. She thought she fell asleep on the way. Mr. Jason ordered some interesting juice, and they felt energized immediately afterwards. That's it. The man wiped his flushed face. Can you feel the blood rushing through your body? He asked Anne. What is it made of? She asked. There are some berries in it, but the main ingredient is natural pomegranate juice. The additives are up to you, said Mr. Jason. He looked at Anne with undisguised curiosity. And the day came to an end. Mr. Jason was returning home with a strange feeling. He had already gone up to the first floor when he clearly felt that the time had come. Lucy, he knocked on the door of his wife's room. Can we talk to you? About what? She said nonchalantly, not leaving the room. That gave Mr. Jason even more confidence in his next move. About us, he said coldly. Come out, please. This is serious. Lucy deliberately delayed her exit. Finally, the door opened, and she cast a disgruntled glance at her husband. Lucy, let's not lie to ourselves, he said simply. We don't love each other and haven't for a long time. So what do you suggest? Carelessly threw the wife. Don't spoil my mood for the night. Divorce, he replied seriously. Lucy, I don't see the point of our relationship anymore. The woman shuddered at first, then quickly pulled herself together and paused. All right, Lucy finally replied, if that's what you decide. She wanted to make him feel guilty. Yes, I have made up my mind. Mr. Jason said firmly, and if you don't mind, then you've made up your mind too. The wife didn't want to show her weakness. She would have liked the abandoned woman option, so she could vilify her husband later. Mr. Jason understood that. In recent years, he had unraveled Lucy's true nature to the point where nothing could surprise him. "I'll talk to the children myself," he suggested. He hesitated about the property. "I agree that you should take your half." Lucy was very happy with that. But Mr. Jason was no fool. He'd been in business too long. His wife was already planning how she would take over his business, but she was in for some unpleasant news. But the time had come. He dialed someone's number. "Hi, Brad. Have you changed your mind about buying my company yet?" he said. Anne was in no mood to go home. She was desperate for sleep. She entered the flat. "Good evening," her mother-in-law said with a certain intonation. "Anne, could we talk to you for a moment?" Anne nodded. She wanted to put an end to the whole story. Everyone sat down at the kitchen table. "Well, I guess I'll start," said Mrs. Caroline. Anne, her tone softened. "We were afraid to tell you, so as not to spook your luck. Anyway, a week ago Michael's doctor informed me that he was much better. He also sternly instructed me that Michael should not take any risks for the time being. With his illness, deterioration can occur very quickly. But Michael was so tired of his illness that he told no one that day and went outside." "I see," Anne replied calmly. "Mrs. Caroline, I beg you, please help Michael to pack his things." Mother and son looked at each other. They couldn't understand what was going on in this situation. "It would be better for him to stay with you," calmly answered her daughter-in-law to her bewilderment. "Michael will recover much faster with you." But she didn't know what to say. "Anne, this is his home. Besides, I work too," said Mrs. Caroline. "That's all right. As they say, home will help," Miss Anne smiled. "And as for this being Michael's house, I'm sorry to disappoint you. This is my flat, and your son will no longer be living there." "Anne, what are you doing?" My husband turned pale. "We're family. I love you." "Well, I doubt that very much." Anne got up from the table. "All right, guests. I'll give you half an hour, take everything you need, and the rest you can pick up later. I'm sorry, I'm very tired today." Michael wanted to make a scene, but his mother signaled him with her hand. She realized that if he overplayed his hand now, they'd never get her back. And it was foolish to lose such a tidbit. Anne had already drifted off to sleep when she heard it. "We're going." She didn't say anything, only heard the lock click and rolled over onto her other side. "Mom, she's crazy." Michael couldn't calm down. "That idiot kicked us out." "Yeah, I'm not even going to look at her after that." "Michael, calm down," said his mother. "If she won't change her mind, then you'll have to make sure you get half the property. Don't be silly. No arguments. Do you understand me?" "I understand." He sat down tiredly on the bed in his old room. "Why did I have to go to that damn shop?" he lamented. Everything would be back to normal now. But Michael didn't realize that if it hadn't been for this incident, another one would have happened. Anne was just ripe for another life. They would have broken up anyway. And if he looked honestly, Michael initially had nothing to gain by the breakup of his and Anne's relationship. The next morning, Anne wasn't embarrassed by her husband's absence. She even felt like she should be. Happy, she went to work, dropped her bag, knocked on the door to the boss. "Mr. Jason, thank you. You have helped me change my life," she said happily. "That's it. I'm divorcing Michael. I don't want to do this anymore." "Anne, I've got news for you too," the boss told her with a serious face. "I sold the company, so you will have a new boss." Anne immediately covered her face with her hands and cried. "How can I be without you?" Jason tried to comfort her, but she continued to cry. No amount of coaxing worked. "Let's go out tonight," Jason suggested. "We could sit somewhere together, okay?" He stared into her eyes. "Yes," she said, and sobbed again. "It'll be okay. I promise." He put his arms around her and pulled her close. "We'll have a serious talk tonight." The work wasn't going well. Anne looked at her watch every now and then. She had lost all interest in what she was doing. The director was not only her boss but also her friend, and it was not easy for her to be so close to another person. She was almost pulling up to the house when Michael called. Anne deliberately didn't pick up the phone. "Yes," Idiots, she cursed. I don't need you. What, you lost your feeder? Now you're just going to have to bite your elbows. Anne had no doubt that Michael was acting under the careful guidance of his mother, Mrs. Caroline. If he wanted his things, he'd find them himself, she decided, so she didn't stay home too long. Anne stood outside the restaurant to which Mr. Jason had invited her. With over an hour to go before the meeting, she just closed her eyes and dreamed. I want a baby, Anne whispered. God, why did I ever want Michael? I never loved him. He was like a leech on me, although now I realize why. The phone rang. It was the chief. He wanted to tell her he'd be here early. I'm already here, Anne laughed. I'm sitting in the car waiting for you. Where are you? She stepped out of the driver's door. Jason was standing by the door. He was holding a gorgeous bouquet. Anne blushed. These are for you. He handed her the flowers. Are you ready to have a good time tonight? You bet, she smiled. Jason, I'll go to the end of the world with you. The man took her by the waist, and they walked in. He had a lot to tell his deputy today. Anne, I'm divorcing my wife, he began. To be fair, I sold my company to a good man, but not for the amount of money that's in the contract. Don't worry, there's nothing criminal about it. It's just that my wife is a bit of an arsehole. I'm sorry, but I don't want to go along with her. So I gave her half, or rather a third, of what I got for the firm. I'm not giving her the house either. Of course, she doesn't want to leave it, so she'll have to pay me my half. Don't worry. What she made in the divorce will last her till she's old enough. Unless she spends $1 million a month. What are you going to do now? Miss Anne asked with interest. You're a real professional. But professionals retire, too, he laughed. Anne, I want a normal life. I need someone who understands me, a reliable friend. The man kept his eyes on her. Anne realized that he was referring to her. Inside her, it was like butterflies were flying. Anne lowered her eyes, her breathing could be heard. She drank some juice as her throat was dry. Anne, I don't want to play. I like you. Took her hand in his. In fact, I think we're made for each other. How Anne at that moment wished she could go back to her childhood and show her classmates who she had become. What kind of man had chosen her? You bastards, this is for you, flashed through her mind. I'm a decent woman, so I want a decent man. I give you time to think, came Mr. Jason's voice to her. And I can answer at once, seriously, she said. I do. I want a normal family. I want to have children. We'll have children. I promise you, he pressed her hand in his. Anne had never had an evening like this in her life. She stood by her car, afraid to let Jason go. He didn't want to leave her either. The goodbye kiss came to an end. They hugged once more, and she got into the car. I'll see you tomorrow, he waved. Good night to you. The woman looked at him intently, but Anne's night was not going to be a very restful one. So far, she knew nothing about it. Driving home, it seemed to her that her car did not touch the ground. Here it is, my long-awaited happiness, she said aloud. We had worked side by side for so many years, and only now we realized that it was fate. She saw the light from the corridor and realized that Michael was home. Michael's doctor arrived today. He's taken a turn for the worse. Because of your scandal, he could die? Please help my son, Mrs. Caroline exclaimed. I can't. Anne shrugged her shoulders. I'm getting married. What, her mother-in-law was surprised. What do you mean you're getting married? What about Michael? He'll die without you. But I'm not to blame for his illness, she glanced at her husband. If you've come to get your things, I'll wait. You can't do that, Michael's mother said sternly. Or did you have a lover? Her eyes narrowed and she looked like a fox. Was that the reason? No, Anne didn't want to continue the conversation. I just met my man the other day, so there was no question of cheating. Her mother-in-law's little eyes darted back and forth. She couldn't figure out what she needed to do to get things back to normal. Anne, her voice softened. But you realize Michael loves you. To know a man for a couple of days and leave a husband like that? She shook her head. I can assure you it's such a relief, Anne grinned. Take it easy. Michael couldn't take it anymore. I've worked so hard to make sure you have everything. She laughed. Are you saying I've been living off you all this time? You have no conscience at all? How much effort I put into my cafe, and all for you. You mean the pie shop that I gave you over $1 million for? Anne had no more patience for these insolents. That's it. I've had enough. Get out. Get out of my flat. She pointed at the door. I just hate you, you sneaky bastards who've been sitting on my neck all this time. Get out. You're going to regret this. Are you going to come crawling back to Michael on your knees? My mother-in-law threatened to say goodbye. Who cares about you, you little bogeyman? My son is a fool for paying attention to you. Ruined his life. She didn't even think it was possible to do such a cruel thing. It's all coming to a head. Anne closed the door behind her guests and sat down on the sofa. God, and how could I have been so blind? They were just using me, she sobbed. Anne was going to leave something to her husband after the divorce. His car she definitely wanted to give him. But after what he and his mum had done, she went on principle. The car had been bought with her money, and she could easily prove it. Michael wasn't working at the time, so the truth was on her side. No matter how hard Mrs. Caroline tried, no matter what lawyer she sent to her, they couldn't do anything. Anne, come on, screamed the guests at the wedding. Mr. Jason kept up with her. This time Anne was having all the fun she could. Miss Anne and her husband were always participating in contests. After signing in, they sat down at the table. Mr. Jason held his wife close to him. She kissed him. My happiness. He kept his eyes on her. Anne, darling. Tears came out of his eyes. And then they went on their honeymoon. The newlyweds didn't want to advertise or surprise anyone. They just went on a tour of Europe. God, this stuff is delicious. Anne closed her eyes in pleasure when she tasted real Viennese waffles. She greedily absorbed everything around her. She hadn't realized she was enjoying the story so much. Jason, look at this, she pointed at the medieval temple. They were standing in a square that was surrounded by stunning buildings. The honeymoon had strengthened the couple even more. They chatted for hours on end. Anne had never experienced, even in her dreams, that it was possible to live like this. Mr. Jason was a grown man, so he didn't give Anne a hard time when someone looked at her or wanted to meet her. Where did this one come from? You're not an ice cream. I can't leave you alone for a minute, he grinned. From Namibia. He complimented me on my beauty, he laughed. Sometimes I wish you'd taken off your glasses when you were wearing them. You didn't get hit on so often by suitors, he supported her laughter. And a year after that journey, Anne had a daughter, a tiny baby Elvira. I've always wanted my daughter to be called Elvira, her father shook her contentedly. I think with such a name she will be a real schoolgirl. I can't wait to chase her. You'll complain later. I'd rather she was in the pram asleep. Anne laughed. Look at her, she's already restless. Elvira changed her voice and waved her arms. Well, Fidgety, come here. Anne took her daughter in her arms and pressed her to her chest. No one had ever thought it was possible to play with one's life like this. The ringtone of her smartphone, ringing out close to lunchtime on a very ordinary working Thursday, once again divided Cassandra's life into the happy period before and the almost hopeless one after. The word mum popped up on the screen, and although calls in the middle of the day weren't too common, the woman had no misgivings about it. Maybe mum missed her or wanted advice on clothing choices. Cassandra put a pencil dot in the margins of the sheet with a variant of the customer's contract and hurried to take the call, so as not to worry her family with a long wait. As soon as the woman heard her mother's voice, which sounded unusually muffled, it seemed to her that her heart plunged downwards. It was obvious that this was not a happy event, and the assumption was unfortunately confirmed. Cassandrachka, hello you, don't worry too much please. I happen to be in the hospital right now. Cassandra, you're freaking out. Mum, what happened? What hospital are you in? What did the doctors say to bring in? What's the room number? A voice from the phone interrupted the flow of questions. Cassandra, I'm begging you, don't worry. It's just like in the cinema. I slipped, fell, almost passed out, but I'm fine. My neighbor Maggie was passing by and she cheered me up and supported me while we waited for the ambulance. The doctor said I'll be fine, but I'll have to stay in hospital for a while. Mum, why didn't you tell me before? I would have rushed over and helped. I didn't want to bother you in the middle of the day, but my office hours are 4 to 7 p.m. in the evening, and if you're going from the office to my house and then to the pharmacy, I was afraid you might not make it. In general, please write down what you need to bring here. The main policy and phone charger are needed. Water not carbonated yet, because for some reason I'm very thirsty. The invisible mum sighed, and the woman imagined how the face of her dear person was distorted from the painful shock and hurried to finish the conversation, specifying the number of the hospital and the room. Cassandra reread the list of things her mother had dictated to her, added chicken broth, wet wipes, and went to ask her supervisor to leave. Mr. Jasper, please allow me to leave early today, for personal reasons. Mum's been admitted to hospital. The boss, a friend of Cassandra's husband's from his student days, expressed polite words of sympathy, and when he found out in which hospital Mum was lying, he encouraged his subordinate and inquired. Well, the doctors in our regional almshouse are good. Maybe the atmosphere is not too luxurious, but the equipment and staff at the top. I've been in this hospital several times and I was discharged as good as new. So you're going to be fine. Don't get too excited. By the way, are you driving the car today or is Kevin driving it? Maybe Nicholas can give you a lift in his car. Cassandra was touched by her boss's concern and decided that she was in no position to refuse. Thank you, Mr. Jasper. That would be very helpful. I won't keep the driver long. I just need to get to Mum's house. I won't keep Nicholas any longer. I'll collect the necessary things and then I'll call a taxi. Thank you. The supervisor wished Cassandra success and promised. Come out in 15 minutes to the main entrance. I'll tell Nicholas to wait for you at your mother's house and drop you off at your and Kevin's family nest. He's coming back for me anyway, and your house is on the way. Thanking her sensitive boss again, Cassandra went to switch off the computer and tidy up her workplace. She had taken the contract with her so as not to let the whole team down and to complete the necessary work by the next morning. The woman was not very good at recognizing the meaning of the stories the driver was trying to entertain her with, but she was grateful that the flow of his speeches made her at least react in some way and prevented her from slipping into anxious thoughts. Following the list, ticking off each recorded item, Cassandra packed up her mother's flat, watered her favorite flowers. She shut off the gas and water just in case, checked to see if there was anything perishable in the fridge, collected the rubbish to throw away, and only then did she go downstairs and set off with the talkative Nicholas next. Not far from Cassandra and Kevin's house, there was a supermarket with a pharmacy inside, and the woman decided to stop there on the way. Asking Nicholas to stop by the container yard, she threw out the rubbish she had collected and rushed off to get some groceries. Moving almost on autopilot, Cassandra bought everything she needed and was soon preparing dinner for her husband and broth for her mother at the same time. While the food was boiling and baking, Cassandra called Kevin and explained the situation. Kevin, Mum is in hospital. I'm going to go and see her. How long I'll be there, I'm not sure yet. Dinner will be on the cooker. The man confessed. I'm aware Jasper told me you need support. You wait for me. I'll try to get there early and we'll go to the hospital together. I'll be there for anything else you might need, but I'll be there for you.
Kevin didn't let his wife down and, grabbing her and the 2 bags she had packed, drove her to the hospital. Cassandra managed to persuade the nurse taking the bags to let her see her mum and the attending doctor, who was thankfully on site. Kevin remained waiting for his wife in the lobby, but gave words of kind words and wishes for a speedy recovery.
Bridget tried to smile when she saw Cassandra enter the room, but she was visibly uncomfortable and frightened. The woman said a soft but distinctive hello to everyone in the room and made her way to her mother's bed. A weight was suspended from the unfortunate woman's right leg, and her lips, bitten almost to the point of blood, were a clear indication that the ice victim was in a lot of pain. Cassandra listened to her mum's story of her predicament and, trying not to cry, began to put everything she had brought into the bedside table. The phone was immediately put on charge. Cassandra gave her mother some broth, made her eat a few spoonfuls of raw, grated carrots. The internet says that such a salad in the first days after the injury the best vitamin remedy. Then sour morses you drink, also useful. Oh, daughter, don't worry. You should probably run. Kevin will be home. He'll probably be surprised you're not here. Cassandra explained that her husband had rushed home when he heard what had happened, so she wouldn't have to take a taxi. That he hadn't been missed, but he'd said hello, as if just waiting for that line. The woman in the next bed became active. The orderlies and nurses here are rude and rude. She intervened in the conversation. You can't call them day or night. They drink tea, spin around in front of doctors, give chocolates, even give money without any use. They're still doing their jobs with their sleeves down. Cassandra kept silent, and having found out from her mother the name and patronymic of her attending doctor, went in search of him. The restless neighbor made a good point. In the residence room, if not, then in the dressing room. Look, there, probably, with someone courtesy. Thanking the grumpy woman dryly, Cassandra went out into the corridor. The nurses in the trauma room, accustomed to all sorts of relatives, tears and hysterics, looked at the visitor, asking how to find a doctor with a mixture of irritation and fatigue. But one of them, who held herself like a superior, answered thoroughly.
Mr. Oliver is in the superintendent's office at the moment. At that end of the corridor is the penultimate door. Wait there, or there is a bench near the resident's room.
Cassandra waited for the doctor, and he recognized her as Bridget's daughter and invited her into the office. Showing a picture on the computer screen, Mr. Oliver explained. If I may say so, your mum's fracture was a success. Generally, there are 2 treatment options. The man began to explain the nuances of each option, then asked, "Which option did you decide on?" Cassandra looked the doctor in the eyes, but did not answer, but asked a counter question. "Tell me, Mr. Oliver, for example, if a patient with a fracture like my mother's was someone close to you, what would you recommend?" Smiling, the doctor replied briefly. "Osteosynthesis. A very similar case. My aunt, our head, performed a similar operation. It's been a year since she is active again, even in the countryside, so I cannot keep up with her." The woman clarified all the details of the upcoming operation, wrote down what else she needed to bring for the post-operative period, and having said goodbye to the doctor, left the office. Cassandra had to announce to her mother that the operation was scheduled for the next day, and having collected herself, the woman presented it as lightly as possible, trying not to upset her mother. "Tomorrow I will come and meet you after the operation. Everything will be fine, don't worry." "Cassandrachka, what about your work? The boss will probably scold you." "Don't worry about that. I'll do my job and I won't let you or the chief down." With the operation, the long road to Bridget being able to walk again had only just begun. For a fortnight, Cassandra visited her mum almost daily to feed and nurse her. The woman tried to object and repeatedly stated, "Cassandra, you take care of yourself. Don't come to see me so often. The food here is not bad, and I do not have an appetite. Where it will come from, if my energy is not spent on anything." But Bridget could not persuade her daughter. When the day of her discharge arrived, Cassandra went to the doctor for recommendations. Mr. Oliver was cautious and warned, "Your mum is a very energetic lady. Well, I've made my point to her, and I'll make my point to you. I wouldn't be overly optimistic if I were you, but there's no need to despair. Although it is impossible to fully rely on the injured limb. Crutches are Bridget's best friends for the next month, and then you should also take care. Of course, it is necessary to move, but carefully. Prophylactic treatment is indicated to prevent pressure sores. I'll be expecting a follow-up X-ray in 6 weeks. We'll see how far along the bone is in the healing process. That's pretty much it." Cassandra checked. "Maybe some vitamins for Mum to take?" Mr. Oliver shrugged. "Well, in principle you could. You'll have to get a rehabilitation plan from your local clinic." Cassandra called a taxi specializing in transporting people with limited mobility, and after a heroic journey through the streets, Bridget was finally in her flat. Cassandra faced a new problem. Her mum's physical condition still left much to be desired. Even a simple trip to the bathroom or kitchen could result in a new injury. For the first time, Cassandra came to Bridget twice a day, and by the New Year holidays she was almost exhausted. The traffic jams were taking up so much time that there were only a few hours left for sleep. Cassandra turned to her husband. "Kevin, let's get Mum to come stay with us for a while. At least I won't have to go back and forth between flats." The man gloomed and after a languid pause replied, "Cassandra, I'm wonderful to your mum. Bridget is a wonderful woman, but I'm sorry, but I'm going to be blunt. There's nowhere to put her here. I mean, it's a studio flat. It's a big room, but there's only one room. When I persuaded you to take out a mortgage, I didn't get any sympathy. Both you and your mum were against it. Kevin, you could put up a screen. It'll be like 2 rooms. Look, but Bridget would be uncomfortable in the first place. I play computer games. I listen to loud music all night. Besides, you should ask her if she'd be willing to move. I'm 100% sure she'll say no. Your mum is very tactful and wise and understands that the further away she lives, the better her relationship with her son-in-law will be." Kevin turned out to be right. Bridget, having barely heard the idea of her son-in-law and daughter moving into the flat, only snorted indignantly. "There can't even be a conversation. The walls help at home. I will not go to you, especially there, and sit quietly. It will be uncomfortable." Cassandra obeyed her mother's will. She didn't want to argue with her husband. She continued to waste time standing in traffic, and the lawyer's position at Mr. Jasper's firm had to be vacated. With her boss's permission, Cassandra had transferred to a half-time position and was glad that her boss had been able to meet her needs. She prepared contracts, visited and trained her successor, and diligently performed all the duties that did not require constant presence in the office. Rehab, however, took a lot more money than the woman had realized. Sometimes she shared with her husband her indignation at the fact that pharmacies changed prices at will and tried to sell the most expensive version of a drug. That's when Kevin would start grumbling. "Look, Cassandra, your mum must have some free medication." The woman tried not to answer. After all, the family budget was not suffering, and she had not asked her husband for money for almost 6 months since the fateful news of her mother's troubles. Cassandra had generally tried to deal with the situation on her own, without interfering with Kevin. As the weather changed, Cassandra's schedule, by tradition, remained almost unchanged. In the morning she made her husband's breakfast and, if she had time, made preparations for lunch and dinner. Then, after putting some of the breakfast in containers, she rushed to her mother's house, stopping at the shops and pharmacies on the way. Nursing, keeping her spirits up and helping her move around the flat took up a lot of her time. Cassandra would then run into the office as well and rush home for the evening. In case of any emergencies, her neighbor, the same Maggie who had helped her wait for the ambulance, had the key to her mother's flat. She would sometimes drop by to watch TV and gossip together. So Bridget wasn't abandoned, but Cassandra was desperate to get her mother back on her feet. And not just because she had to spend a lot of time traveling back and forth between the distant parts of the city every day, without holidays and weekends. Mom was simply the closest person to her. She had, in fact, given Cassandra the gift of life twice. The first time on her birthday 38 years ago, but more importantly later, when a terrible tragedy struck Cassandra in a terrible avalanche. It was her mother who was there for her in those black days, helping her to move around when her legs almost collapsed on nervous grounds, forcing her to drink and eat, then by persuasion, then through force. Abandoning her monetary and not dusty job, her mother sold the flat in their hometown and, almost like a huge and clumsy cube, moved it 2,000 kilometers away from the place where everything Cassandra reminded her of her inhuman grief. It was Bridget who had forced her into a job where it was almost impossible to be alone with her sad thoughts, where she had to look stylish and trim. Cassandra didn't consider her help to her mum to be a sacrifice and, despite her tiredness, tried to take care of her husband, especially since the 10th wedding anniversary was approaching, and the woman wanted to arrange a touching congratulation and a pleasant surprise for patient Kevin. She made a preliminary version of the menu, found a confectionery where orders were made according to individual designs, and agreed to prepare an unusual shaped cake for her husband, who loves sweets. The holiday was approaching, but shortly before it arrived, Kevin, during morning breakfast, warned. "Sorry, Cassandra, but I need a car for a few days. I have to go to the branch in the neighboring region, because it seems that the branch manager is messing up her reports, and the profits are down many times over. Although in other divisions everything is even, and in some places even growth is observed. Of course, I'll try to make a quick trip, but planes are unlikely to fly in those parts. I don't feel like traveling by train. Can you manage without a car?" Cassandra herself was counting on the faithful family horse, but she didn't argue. After all, her husband really needed the car more. She smiled. "I'll manage, of course." Kevin thanked her politely for breakfast and promised. "It's okay, we'll buy you an iron horse too. Once the situation at work normalizes a bit, you'll be able to choose a model." Running out of the house, the man kissed his wife on the cheek, winked and said, "Don't worry, I remember about our wedding anniversary. I'll try to be there by Friday evening." Taking advantage of her husband's absence, Cassandra moved in with her mother for a while so she wouldn't waste time traveling. During these few days, she managed to do a general cleaning, and the flat became somehow especially fresh in spring. Only on the eve of the holiday, Cassandra had to return home to bring her urgently needed diploma to the office. It was a good thing, though, because she also had to clean up the house and make some of Kevin's favorite salads. In the morning, the woman took the festive treats that had been put aside in separate containers and rushed to her mother's house. She habitually gave her a massage, helped her walk around her room, and even after waiting for the lift repairs to be completed, finally took her mother outside to enjoy the nice weather and enjoy the feeling of life returning to the way it was before the injury. After a short walk, Bridget and Cassandra had lunch, and the daughter began to apologize. "Mom, I'm sorry, please forgive me. I'm going to leave early today. I want to surprise Kevin. Turn the telly off when you get bored. Your phone is charged. Call me if you need anything, okay? Run, Cassandra. Happy holidays to you and Kevin. It's been 10 years together." Kissing her mom, Cassandra ran down the route she had planned. Spring, which had long ago come into its own and was rapidly approaching summer, gave soft warmth, and the sweet and tart scent of blossoming lilacs set her in the most romantic mood. Contrary to popular belief that getting married in May was a sign of trouble, she didn't have to worry about it in her second marriage. On the contrary, Kevin was a safe haven for a woman. There were no violent passions between them, but there was mutual sympathy and respect. Cassandra appreciated her husband for the fact that he did not pry into her soul, did not harass her with jealousy and suspicion, did not demand to give birth to an heir or heiress. It was only when he declared his intentions to be serious that Cassandra warned him directly and honestly that children were not part of her plans. The man was not frightened by this statement. A few years after the wedding, Kevin asked if she had changed her mind about the child, but having heard a categorical no, did not begin to find out the reasons and did not raise this topic again. The man was a good partner, and of course she loved him in her own way, with all the strength that a wounded heart was capable of. Following the list she'd made the day before, Cassandra bought drinks, got the calamari Kevin adored. And so she bought all sorts of little things: crusty baguette, fresh green salad, fruit. The 2 large shopping bags that Cassandra had thoughtfully brought with her gradually filled up. Hanging them on both shoulders, she ran into the pastry shop where she had ordered the cake. Now it was safe to go home. Cassandra looked hopefully at the family parking space and sighed with relief there was no car, so she would have time to set the table, hang the balloons and dress up before her husband returned. She praised herself mentally for the handy bags, thanks to which one hand was free. Hurriedly opening the doors, the woman finally found herself in the family nest. Placing the box of cake on the banquet, Cassandra suddenly froze with surprise. In the familiar hum of a residential apartment building, there was a foreign sound coming from the kitchen. Strangely, there were no foreign shoes on the mat, no strangers' belongings visible, but the clatter of dishes came to her quite clearly. It was as if someone was moving a massive plate or a bulky mug. Kevin and Cassandra didn't have any pets. They had all wanted to get a cute dog, but unhappiness with Mum had tweaked that plan. It probably would have been much smarter to go out to the playground, close the door, and call her husband, but from exhaustion, Cassandra didn't act as safety dictated. automatically pulling her trainers off her feet, and right with her bags on her shoulders, the woman walked into the kitchen and nearly collapsed in surprise. Tucking one leg under herself on a chair sat a boy of about 6 years old from the looks of it. The unknown little guest was completely engrossed in his meal. On the table in front of him was Kevin's huge mug, a bottle of water, and a large deep plate into which Cassandra had assembled the puffed salad from the evening before, so that it had time to soak in. The spoon sticking out from the edge was a clear indication that the dish had already been unceremoniously sampled. The child was biting into a stick of raw smoked sausage with gusto, and the woman's heart ached as the memories came flooding back. It was too painful to act rationally. For a few seconds, Cassandra even thought she was hallucinating due to overexertion or some other reason. However, the vision was too realistic in both sound and image, and even sausage-flavored. The engrossed boy broke away from his tasty pastime only after Cassandra, wheezing slightly from nervousness, caught his attention with a question. "Hello. Who are you and what are you doing here?" The boy jumped up from his chair and, without letting go of the sausage from his hand, reported, "My name is Thomas Brown. Uncle Kevin brought me here, told me to wait here for him, said I could eat whatever I wanted. So I'm eating. It's good sausage, but it's very salty." Cassandra had no idea that the man the boy called Uncle Kevin was not her husband Kevin. Such an incredible coincidence as in the film, when the hero didn't realize he had opened someone else's flat with his own keys and was completely unconcerned by anything in the typical setting of a standard flat, simply couldn't have happened. Alexandra could safely vouch that it was not easy to find even a closely similar design as in her and her husband's accommodation. Of course, the situation, with the appearance of a boy in the kitchen, must have a logical explanation, the woman thought. She herself, having married Kevin, had become Taylor, and the surname Brown meant absolutely nothing to her. Her husband was an only child with his parents, but he had cousins and cousins, as far as Cassandra knew. Except they hadn't been invited to the modest wedding, and she didn't know them not only by sight but by their last names. So it was quite possible that the Thomas Brown sitting in front of her was the child of one of her husband's cousins. But why did he, without even warning, suddenly brought this boy to their flat? Shaken out of her psychological equilibrium, Cassandra couldn't concentrate. Her thoughts were jumbled, and she didn't even have time to come up with any plausible theories before Kevin called. Coming out of her daze, Cassandra finally took the bags off her shoulders and took the call. The man began to speak quickly, literally not letting his wife get a word in edgewise. "Beloved, you and I have just missed each other by a little bit. I've just left Bridget's flat, and I'll be there in 20 minutes to explain everything to you. In the meantime, set the table, will you?" The bewildered woman cheered up a little and replied briefly, "Okay." She could feel Thomas's gaze on her very clearly, but she could not find the strength to look him in the eye. The woman brought her new slippers from the corridor, just recently bought in anticipation of the approaching summer season, and suggested, "Thomas, it's hot at home in sneakers. Keep the flip-flops. Put on more comfortable and convenient will be." The child silently obeyed. To defuse the situation and to occupy the boy she had dropped off, but to avoid having to talk to him a lot, Cassandra asked, "Thomas, do you know how to inflate balloons?" The boy nodded. The woman quickly went to the room, brought the child a whole package, opened it. Then, on some impulse, rinsed the tips through which Thomas was to inflate the balloons and handed it to him, asking, "You inflate not too much. When you get tired, rest. And I'll help you tie them. Agreed?" The child nodded dutifully and, without any embarrassment, asked, "And your name, Cassandra, is it?" Cassandra shrugged her shoulders. "Yes. That's a beautiful name. Thank you." There was silence in the kitchen. The boy, thinking about something, busied himself with the balloons. Cassandra, watching her guest with a sidelong glance, began to unpack her bags, prepare what she had planned, and gradually set the table. She put the cake in the fridge, and, distracted by the thought of tying the balloons Thomas had inflated, felt a pinch of pain rather than irritation. She wasn't angry with her husband, but there were all sorts of thoughts running through her mind. The woman felt the curious gaze of the little guest, but did not dare to look him in the eye. so they looked at each other but hardly spoke to each other. Cassandra didn't notice when Kevin entered the kitchen with a huge bouquet of roses in his hands and a large bag. The man put the bag on the floor and handed the flowers to his wife. "Cassandra, congratulations to you and myself on our holiday. I see you've met Thomas and made friends? How marvelous. Well then, let's celebrate." The boy, visibly cheerful after Kevin's appearance, said modestly, "Congratulations." And as everyone sat down at the table after the inevitable fuss, he loudly boasted, "Uncle Kevin, I inflated the balloons myself and Cassandra helped me tie them. Did we give you a good surprise?" The grown man mumbled something in response to the little guest's chatter, praising Thomas and his wife, who hadn't even touched her food. There was a sense of tension in the flat, and Kevin set about remedying the situation. He turned on the music softly and began to praise his wife's cooking enthusiastically. Then he made a toast to Cassandra's beauty and charm. He took a box out of his pocket, handed it to her, and said, "Congratulations, I hope you like it." The woman, confused in her assumptions and thoughts about why her husband had brought a child into the flat, only now remembered her gift. Leaving the not-too-cheerful company for a while, Cassandra clutched the never-opened box in the palm of her hand, pulled out the hidden present. Returning to the table, she handed the bundle to her husband and confined herself to a meager phrase. "Happy tin wedding anniversary." Kevin hastily tore the wrapping paper and began to loudly admire the pewter cup and began to show the gift to Thomas. The woman felt uncomfortable and sank back into her thoughts. Not at all how she had imagined celebrating her wedding anniversary. She had wanted to prepare a surprise, but her husband had managed not just to surprise her, but to completely throw her off balance in the most natural way. Cassandra coughed violently, choking on her mineral water when she heard the question. "Cassandra, Thomas is going to stay with us for a couple of weeks, okay?" Cassandra was silent, not knowing what to say. Kevin tried to justify himself. "I went to Bridget's to pick you up on my way home and I wanted to explain everything to you. But I didn't have time, so it was a surprise. I'm sorry I didn't think to warn you, but I was sure I'd catch you at Mum's, and on the way I'd let you know we had a visitor." Kevin's monologue ended in a long silence. Cassandra moved the food on her plate with her fork without raising her eyes to her husband. He, confused, didn't know what else to say for himself. With childlike directness, Thomas broke into the silence by asking in a ringing voice, "Aunt Cassandra, thank you, I've already eaten, but can I have some cake now?" The boy showed the empty plate, and with a stony face Cassandra got up from her chair and walked to the fridge. She wanted to scream, to stomp her feet, to cry, and to hit the dishes soiled like her faith in her husband's honesty, but she knew it wouldn't make it any easier. The most likely explanation for Kevin bringing Thomas to the flat seemed to her to be his cheating husband. With her whole being, Cassandra now hated the man she had loved for 10 years as much as she knew how. Kevin, who knew his wife well, guessed from her jerky movements that she would say everything she had on her mind, and decided to take the little guest away from the table to a sitting area where he could distract himself from the upcoming serious conversation between the adults. "Thomas, come on, I'll switch on the games console. I have mostly complicated games, but we can find something to your taste on the internet. Or I'll switch on cartoons if you want." "Will you be able to eat cake there?" the boy asked interestedly. Of course, everything is possible there. The boy's eyes sparkled, and he trustingly followed the owner of the flat to a cozy, soft corner. Cassandra, having heard her husband and guest talking, cut off a large piece of cake, carefully placed it on a plate, switched on the electric kettle and carefully watched it boil. The click of the switch being switched off brought her out of her reverie. Making the tea, the woman placed a cup of the tasty drink, sugar and spoon, and a plate of cake on a tray, and then took it to the table near the play area of the flat. Kevin was showing Thomas a collection of computer games, but the boy, who was clearly well-mannered, broke away from the fascinating activity and thanked her. "Thank you very much." The woman nodded and, turning abruptly, walked away. When Kevin walked into the kitchen, he found a strange sight. Cassandra sitting on the floor, holding a dirty-looking pair of children's sneakers, tears rolling down her cheeks. The man tried to make a joke. "Cassandra, come on." A child with dirty shoes walked into the kitchen. "We'll switch on the Hoover robot and let it work. It's not a big deal. Is it worth getting upset over a little dust? Especially since it was a holiday." Cassandra looked at her husband in a way that made him uncomfortable and said quietly, "Kevin, I think I've told you repeatedly that I don't want to be in the same space with the children for too long. It's beyond me. I guess your action, or as you put it, your surprise, had good reasons, and I can understand that. But I'm sorry, Bet. I don't have the slightest desire to deal with the proceedings today. I'm going to go to my mum's and stay with her for a while." Kevin could not understand the reason for his wife's categorical decision, but he could see that Cassandra was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, so he proposed. "Cassandra, I'm really guilty for not warning you, but I can explain. I think that when you hear me out, you'll realize that I just couldn't have done it any other way. I'll wait until you're ready to talk." The woman suddenly gently lowered the children's sneakers to the floor, wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, and walked to the door as if she hadn't heard her husband. Kevin took his wife's hand and asked, "Cassandra, wait a minute. I'll call a taxi to Bridget's house, so I don't have to worry about you." Cassandra nodded and was soon in the car, fumbling with the strap of her purse. The road was clear, and the journey to her mother's house took much less time than it did during peak hours. Hardly had the woman opened the door when she heard it. "Maggie, come in, dear. I'm not feeling very well." Cassandra closed the door behind her and took off her shoes and walked into her mum's bedroom. Bridget became alarmed when she saw her daughter. "Cassandrachka, why are you back? Didn't Kevin come home? I reckon your wedding anniversary should be in full swing and you're here for some reason. Daughter, what's wrong?" Cassandra walked over to her mother's bed, sat down on the floor, and leaned her head on Bridget's palm and recounted everything that had happened since she had come home and seen Thomas there. When she had finished, Cassandra made a suggestion. "Mum, I'm pretty sure Thomas is Kevin's illegitimate son. The boy looks to be about 6 years old, which means my husband has been giving me the horns and has the nerve to show me evidence of his infidelity on our wedding anniversary." Bridget tried to reassure her daughter. "I'm sure Kevin can explain everything. I feel he loves you. Trust my experience. He would hardly risk his relationship with you and cheat." However, Cassandra cried without stopping. The woman stroked her so grown-up but defenseless sobbing girl, but did not utter any more words because they were all powerless. Finally, when the flow of tears had dried up, Cassandra silently got up from the floor and went to wash her face swollen with tears. The woman felt completely devastated. Returning to her mother's room, Cassandra confessed, "I'm very tired for today, and do you mind if I lie down?" Bridget did not object and suggested, for example, that we talk some more and have dinner. She realized that her unfortunate daughter needed to rest. "Of course, Cassandrachka, but why don't you and I have a sedative, at least some valerian? It would do you and me good." Cassandra complied with her mother's request and went to bed. The nervous tension was so intense that the woman passed out and woke up when it was 10 o'clock in the morning. Jumping up on the couch, Cassandra rushed to the kitchen, where she found her mother stirring the batter for pancakes. "Good morning, daughter. You're just in time for breakfast." The women cooked the pancakes in 4 hands and, as if in agreement, never said a word about yesterday's situation. As Cassandra washed the dishes, Bridget asked, "Daughter, please go to the theater with Maggie. She has 2 tickets to a very good play, great seats. Her niece gave them to her for her birthday. They were supposed to go together, but as luck would have it, her niece got sick. The rest of the family can't keep Maggie company. Someone's got a holiday cottage, someone's traveling on a business trip. All in all, it's a shame to lose the ticket." Cassandra shook her head. "Mum, I don't want to go anywhere I'm not in the mood." But if Bridget had something on her mind, she knew how to insist. "That's why you should go, because you're not in the mood. Art is great at shifting thoughts in your head and changing your emotions. Please, daughter, not for the sake of the missing ticket, but for me." Reluctantly, Cassandra had to comply with her mum's wish. However, she refused the offer to run to the hairdresser's beforehand and get a new haircut. After waiting for Maggie to take Cassandra away, Bridget called her son-in-law and said in an almost commanding tone, "Kevin, Cassandra will be gone for about 3 hours. Come over. We need to talk." The man did not resist, but warned, "Bridget, I'll definitely come. But I don't have anyone to leave Thomas with. I can probably find a nanny, but I wouldn't trust the boy to someone I don't know, so I can only come with him. Do you mind?" The woman sighed. "I don't mind." "Good. Then I'll be at your place with Thomas in half an hour." 30 minutes later, Bridget carefully reached the door, leaning on a steady walker, and let Kevin and Thomas into the flat. The man introduced the child, and the boy said hello politely. The landlady tried not to show her incredible excitement and invited Thomas into the kitchen. "Come in, I have a TV and cakes waiting for you. Do you want cocoa or tea?" The child announced that coffee was the most delicious for him, but that children should not drink this drink often, and he would have tea, because he was too old for cocoa. Bridget almost laughed out of surprise, but she got her emotions under control in time and, turning to Kevin, asked, "Can I give Thomas a chicory drink then? It's almost like coffee." The boy got excited. "I want to try this chicory, Uncle Kevin, can I?" Kevin agreed, and when the hostess had cleverly prepared the treat for Thomas, the man handed the boy his smartphone and explained, "I need to have a chat with Bridget. You please stay here. Eat the treats, play on your phone, maybe even watch some clips on the internet for a bit, okay?" "Sure, Uncle Kevin. I'm perfectly capable of unsupervised. Don't worry." Watching this picture, Bridget could hardly contain herself from crying and hiding her emotions. She slowly began to walk towards the room, which was called the hall in the old-fashioned way. She was followed by Kevin, who was eager to find out what Bridget wanted to talk to him about. The woman sat down in the armchair, and the man sat on the sofa across from it, so that the conversation could be carried on comfortably. The hostess looked at her son-in-law attentively, but he did not bear it for long and asked without preamble, "Bridget, can you explain to me why Cassandra reacted so inappropriately to Thomas's appearance in our flat? I admit it was my fault for not warning her, but we're adults. Instead of having a calm conversation, she basically just ran to you. Is that normal?" The woman did not interrupt her son-in-law's indignant speech, but she did not hurry to answer his question, but asked a counter-question. "Before I start a difficult conversation to try to help my daughter keep her family together, I need to be sure it makes sense. Tell me honestly, is Thomas your illegitimate son?" The man's outrage was unparalleled. "No, of course I'd never think of cheating on Cassandra. I love her very much, I respect her, but her attitude towards children is beginning to frighten me. Thomas ended up in our flat because of a desperate situation, but Cassandra didn't even try to get along with him. Although, as you may have noticed, he is a well-mannered, bright, and charming boy." Kevin's answer calmed the worried woman, and taking a deep breath as if preparing to parachute in, she decided to tell her son-in-law the truth. "Well, all things secret, as they say, come to light. As a husband, you have the right to know why my daughter avoids contact with my children. I think I have the right to tell you her story, which at first seemed like a happy fairy tale, and then turned into a terrible nightmare that destroyed the usual life. Cassandra grew up to be a marvelous and clever girl, a real joy to me and my husband. We had no trouble getting her into one of the best grammar schools in our city. The wealth of our family and the positions held by me and my husband allowed Cassandra to be her own among the same, as they say, the golden youth. However, the gymnasium had a very strong teaching staff and grades were not for sale, as you might think. Children were skillfully interested in learning, and our Cassandrachka was one of the best students in the class. She was even sort of made a mentor for her desk mate Michael. The boy was from a very good family, quite influential in our town. Just kidding, his dad is a regional prosecutor. His mom is in the same department, not on the last position. In general, they were better off than our family, but they did not hinder the development of friendship between their son and Cassandra. They sincerely welcomed her, and they did not talk to me and my husband through the lip, but quite kindly. When Cassandra was in year 10, her father died suddenly. A blood clot had broken off, as the autopsy showed. It was Michael's family that supported me and Cassandra after this loss. I still thank them for that, because I was in such a state that I almost went to my husband. So of course I didn't mind at all when Cassandra decided to marry Michael. So what if they were just over 18 at the time? Obviously you can't stand in the way of real feelings. Michael's parents didn't mind either, and were even happy that my daughter was part of their family. A year after the wedding, Cassandra and Michael had twins and 2 boys, Stephen and Marcus. Healthy, happy, strong. They grew up and made us all happy. Cassandra couldn't get enough of her babies. You know, Kevin, she used to tell me that she was walking, rolling the pram in front of her, and her heart would jump out of her chest from happiness. Of course, I helped whenever I could. My husband's mom repeatedly suggested that Cassandra hire a reliable nanny, but my daughter refused every time, and she mostly managed on her own. God knows what it cost her, but she didn't give up her university studies, and even managed to manage without a sabbatical. And her husband's father got her a prestigious and well-paid job, a position where the working day was strictly rationed, and there was a social package and other niceties. He had the opportunity, of course. And he was not ashamed to patronize his daughter-in-law. Cassandrachka was a clever girl. Stephen and Marcus were 6 years old when my daughter became pregnant again. Michael welcomed the news with joy, and there was nothing to be sad about. The family had a wonderful relationship. As far as I knew, there had never been a fight between them. It was as if the 2 halves were lucky enough to be united as one. I know a lot of people were jealous, and some ladies tried to have an affair with Michael, but he didn't want anyone but my Cassandrachka. Everything was so perfect that I didn't even think that everything would fall apart overnight because of a terrible tragedy. Cassandrachka had to go to the doctor, and Michael volunteered to pick up his sons from kindergarten. Ridiculously, his car broke down that day, so he decided not to call a taxi, but to take the children home through the park. The weather was fine, and although the rides were not yet open, there was a pizzeria at the exit of the park that the boys wanted to go to. Michael met a mate on the way, and while he was talking to him, the kids got excited and ran out onto the lake, but the March ice was treacherously thin. My grandchildren, as witnesses told me later, did not even have time to shout. They went under the water in a flash. Michael and his mate rushed to the pond, but there was no way to catch the boys, managed only to arrive at the scene of the tragedy divers. Michael later tried to justify himself as wound up, constantly repeating that he was distracted only for a few seconds, but what good? Our boys had drowned, and it could not be undone. My son-in-law was the first to tell me this bitter news, because he was afraid for Cassandra, and for good reason. I went to the private clinic where I knew Cassandrachka was at that time. My heart told me that it was better to have doctors close by when the worst of grief came upon my daughter. Seeing me in the corridor, Cassandra must have realized everything from my face. She had been hysterical since the news of what had happened. Even a large dose of medication could not calm Cassandra down. She never made it home that night, ending up in hospital with a nervous breakdown. Because of her worries about her dead sons, my daughter was unable to save the baby that was developing under her heart. He wasn't even considered a baby by the doctors. She had already lost him. At the funeral of Stephen and Marcus, Cassandra stood like a stone statue, no tears, no emotion, pale as death. Especially terrible was the emptiness in her eyes. Michael was no less worried. Having turned gray in his 25 years, he tried to take Cassandra's hand for support, but she shied away from him like a leper. She never again crossed the threshold of the flat where she lived with her husband and sons. How many times Michael had tried to talk to her could not be counted, but it had never worked. Cassandra just cut her husband out of her life. Michael's mother came to us. Having realized that my daughter did not want to see or hear from her husband, she was on her knees, begging me to forgive her son, saying that he was not like himself. She shared her sad thoughts that he was on the verge of leaving this world, but Cassandra did not react. She had never forgiven her husband for the loss of her sons. Michael could not forgive himself either. Indeed, he had turned from a blossoming man into a pale semblance of his former self. Cassandra predictably quit her job, seemingly of her own volition, but in fact everyone realized that she simply could not be under public scrutiny. In addition, there was an unusual and unexpected problem. Her daughter was approaching hysterics. It was worth it to go outside and see the child. She changed her route, but it was impossible to absolutely eliminate the possibility of meeting children. One day, Cassandra and I were riding in the lift, and a neighbor with a baby came in with us. Everything seemed to be normal, but I rejoiced too early. After the traveling companion got out of the lift, I looked at my daughter and saw that her chin was bleeding. She had bitten her lip so hard trying to hold back a tantrum. After this incident, my daughter stayed at home all day and night for almost a month. I even called a special doctor, the best of the best, at home. There were changes, but not quick and not at all positive. After a period of apathy, my daughter became aggressive. It was as if she had an obsession, and the medication prescribed by the doctor could not cope with it for long. Cassandra would take the pills for a few hours, fall into a state of indifference to everything, then begin to think about something painfully, walking from side to side in the room. One day I saw that she was looking for poison options online, and I was seriously frightened. I realized that my daughter had decided to deal with the unwitting perpetrator of her children's deaths. I tried to stay close to my daughter at all times to make sure she didn't do anything irreparable. Once, Cassandrochka managed to leave the house in the morning while I was asleep. People told me later that she caught Michael at his work and attacked him with her fists. She was screaming, "You, why do you live and our sons don't?" I don't know, maybe my acquaintances exaggerated, but supposedly 4 strong men could barely pull her away from the confused Michael. He didn't even resist. When I came to pick her up, my daughter was sitting in the back room, where there was the aroma of the hated sedative and some other drugs, and almost did not react to anything. I was told that an ambulance had come and sedated Cassandra. Among my acquaintances and neighbors, of course, there was only talk of my grandchildren's accident and Cassandra going mad with grief. One day, Michael's father called me and urged me to leave town with his daughter. You don't say no to people like him. Besides, I'd been thinking of ways to hide my daughter from sympathetic and prying eyes. I quit my job, sold my flat. Again, thanks to my son-in-law's parents, I managed to do it both quickly and at a price that was quite adequate, given the urgency. Cassandra and Michael were divorced in absentia. Again, thanks to his relatives. My daughter didn't even have to go anywhere. We ended up moving to this town, away from everything that was, and then you know the rest, Kevin. You met her, and my daughter started coming back to life. Don't get me wrong, Cassandra's not bad with kids. She's just still in pain. She refuses to be a mom again for fear of repeating the nightmare she went through. Bridget was silent as she recounted her daughter's terrible story. The woman was exhausted mentally. Kevin noticed how pale her face had become and hurried to the kitchen to fetch her some water. Thomas was playing on his phone, and the man stroked his head, filled a glass, and returned to Bridget in the hall. "I'm sorry to make you remember everything." The woman took a careful drink of her water and spoke bitterly. Kevin, if only it could be forgotten at all. I probably should have told you about Cassandra's past sooner, but I've been hesitant to say it out loud. My daughter, I understand, still can't talk about it either. The man looked at the woman, puzzled, and confessed. To be honest, I had no idea that Cassandra's reluctance to become a mum could hide such a tragedy. I thought she probably didn't want to ruin her figure. I can't imagine how she must have felt when she saw Thomas in our kitchen. What a surprise I managed to surprise her on our anniversary. How am I supposed to apologize to Cassandra and make her understand? I really had nowhere to bring Thomas, and for a number of reasons. The boy needed to stay for a week or two in a safe and comfortable place where his parents' enemies wouldn't think to look. I arrived at the branch and bumped into an old mate I hadn't seen since the demobilization. Winston was more than a friend to me. It was thanks to him that I survived the army, but that's a long story. In the civilian life, we were separated by our hometowns, and as it happens, our contacts were lost. I tried to find him on social networks, but without success. Perhaps I should have been more persistent in my search. Then I would have found him. But I was building my career. Anyway, I haven't seen him for 15 years, and now I'm meeting Winston in a city that's foreign to both of us. Of course, he had changed over the years, but I recognized him at once. He almost walked past me without noticing, but I stopped him. It turned out that Winston had come to solve the problems of his sister and her husband. They were involved in a lawsuit with not too adequate people, who used to conduct all affairs in a criminal way. Winston was most worried about Thomas, his nephew. He explained to his sister that the child should be hidden just in case, because through him these bandits could easily influence the decision of the issue in their favor, but they could not think of any safe place. And then I come out of nowhere. To Winston, the idea of getting Thomas out of town seemed the ideal. In fact, there were virtually no strings that could put the bandits on the child's trail. It was good that the boy had a strong character, a real man growing up. His parents and Winston told him he had to stay with me for a while, and he took the news in stride. I picked him up like a detective so I wouldn't get caught on the city's security cameras. We agreed to contact Winston in a week, and he should call me when the matter was resolved. Thomas, of course, is a perfect boy. He got used to being in an unfamiliar place. He even went to bed by himself after brushing his teeth. All we have to do is wait for Winston to call. Thomas is very easy for me to talk to, but I have to go to work on Monday and I can hardly take him with me. I don't know what to do now. Kevin was silent, and then Cassandra's voice came out of the blue. It's no big deal. You go to work as usual and I'll stay with Thomas. Just leave me the car so I don't have to take public transport to get to and from Mom. It turned out that, contrary to Bridget's calculations, her daughter had already returned from the theater and seemed to have heard some part of her husband's story. Preempting her mother's question, Cassandra explained. I couldn't watch the play in the theater. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, and realized I couldn't go back and look at the stage without even trying to get into the story. So I typed Maggie an apology and came here. Turns out I got back just in time. I guess I should have heard Thomas's story from the outside, because Kevin, I'm sorry I suspected you of cheating and I wouldn't have believed you if you'd told me all that yesterday. I can see the situation more clearly today. Mom, you don't mind if I visit you with Thomas, do you? The woman, trying not to frighten away the change in her daughter's attitude towards her children, spoke very carefully. Of course you can come. Bridget wanted to say something else, but her eyes were watering, and she decided to change the subject. Cassandrachka, Kevin, aren't you hungry? I could eat something right now. Let's go into the kitchen. All the more reason to see how Thomas is doing, see if he's bored. I've forgotten all about the rules of hospitality. The boy saw Cassandra and said hello, and the woman's voice trembled slightly as she responded to his greeting. Kevin, who had understood the reason for his wife's strange behavior, was now amazed at her resilience. She had been through such an ordeal and had never tried to appeal to his pity or to elicit sympathy with stories of what she had faced. Cassandra gently but insistently dismissed Bridget's attempts to feed everyone gathered in her kitchen that evening. Thank you, Mum, for everything, but we'll probably go home. I'll stop by tomorrow close to lunchtime. Kevin, who realized he had received his wife's forgiveness, was overjoyed and bid Bridget a heartfelt farewell, promising, "We'll all visit you all together tomorrow. If your health permits and the weather is warm, we can go out into the countryside. How would you like that, Bridget?" Wonderful, Kevin, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. After saying goodbye to Cassandra's landlady, Kevin and Thomas went to the other side of town. The man sat behind the wheel and watched in the mirror as his wife carefully fastened the boy's seatbelt. It was obvious that for Cassandra it was a completely natural gesture, once perfected to the point of automaticity. She was obviously a caring mother. She loved her children very much, and after her misfortune she was suffering in a way that her worst enemy could not wish for. Carefully parked the car at the entrance. The man carried the sleeping Thomas in his arms to the flat. Cassandra straightened out the rumpled sheet on the couch, carefully removed the boy's shoes, and covered the child with a blanket. Watching his wife, Kevin felt incredible tenderness for her. Suddenly, the woman he loved opened up to him from an unfamiliar side of her personality, and he realized that he had made the absolutely right choice. Later, with the door to the kitchen closed, they drank tea with the remaining cake, and it was as if there had been no wall of misunderstanding between them yesterday. With jokes and kisses, they planned the schedule for Sunday afternoon. The man dared to bring up the unpleasant subject and confessed. "Cassandra, I am a real idiot. I almost ruined everything with my act, and I want to say thank you very much for your understanding." The wife smiled. "Well, I, to be honest, also overreacted, so I propose to forget bygones." The weekend went cheerfully and even better than the spouses had anticipated. They'd managed to get Bridget out for a walk, too, and she'd been much less happy about the sunny May day than she'd been about her daughter's happy eyes. Cassandra was happy to answer Thomas's questions and also kept a constant eye on him to make sure he wasn't in danger. Neither her mother nor her husband dared reprimand her for being overprotective. Thomas didn't seem to care that he was surrounded by the utmost care. By agreement with Cassandra, he called her by her first name without using the word aunt and seemed quite content with his unexpected journey. When they had brought Bridget home after the entertainment, the trio had to wait, for there was no chance of leaving the woman without being fed. No one minded, though. Late that night, as Cassandra was putting Thomas to bed, the boy quietly asked her, "Do you think my parents are doing well? Will I be able to see them soon?" Trying to keep her voice firm and convincing, Cassandra replied, "Of course they are doing well. Very soon they will do all their business, and you will meet them." The boy fell asleep. Cassandra, afraid of waking the child, beckoned her husband into the kitchen and began to ask him about the story Thomas's parents were involved in. "Cassandra, I honestly don't even know all the details. Winston gave me a very brief outline, but I realized that his sister and her husband had been attacked by some really bad guys." The woman began to clarify, asking unexpected questions for her husband. "Are these bandits from the city where you went, or are they newcomers? Did your friend give you any nicknames?" Kevin told everything he knew, but Cassandra didn't have enough information and suddenly asked, "Can you get in touch with Winston in an emergency? I need some clarification from him to try and help Thomas' parents. Of course he's doing well and quite comfortable with us, I hope, but it shouldn't be that mom and son are separated for too long." From Cassandra's voice, it was impossible to guess how close she had taken Thomas and his parents' situation to heart. But now, knowing about his wife's past, Kevin realized how difficult it was for her. "Winston actually gave me a password to a chat room where all messages are automatically burnt. I think we can try to contact him." The man opened the necessary site, entered the data he had learnt by heart at the request of his army friend, and after a few minutes he exclaimed with joy, "It worked. Winston, you've greeted me." Cassandra thoughtfully advised, "Kevin, ask him a question, by the answer to which you can tell for sure whether your friend is talking to you or not. And if there is even the slightest doubt, immediately close the site and take the phone card out of your phone." Alarmed by his wife's suspicions, Kevin quickly typed a few phrases and eagerly awaited the reply. After reading the message he received, the man exhaled in relief. "All is well, that's for sure, Winston," he replied with our code phrase. Cassandra nodded and asked, "Great, text Winston that your wife will be texting him now and give me the phone number. I'll find out from your friend what I need to know." No longer surprised, Kevin handed the smartphone to his wife. She texted with someone she didn't know for quite a while. Then she grabbed a pen, quickly wrote a number on a bread wrapper, tore off a piece of paper with numbers, clutched it in her hand, and handed the phone to her husband. "I'm going to the bathroom. I need to make a call. Text Winston to come to this chat room in an hour. Then hopefully I can give him something concrete." Cassandra walked out of the kitchen and into the bathroom, which had the best noise insulation in the flat. Taking a few deep breaths, the woman dialed her ex-husband's father's memorized number. The phone was unavailable. Cassandra summoned all her willpower and dialed her ex-husband's number. Soon his voice came through the receiver. "I'm listening. Don't be silent." Cassandra's voice became hoarse with excitement, and she answered, "Michael, hello, it's Cassandra. I need your help. Or rather, I think your dad can solve the situation, but I can't reach him. The robot says the phone is out of range." The man's demanding tone softened considerably. "Cassandra, it's good to hear from you. My father is overseas, but if you tell me what the problem is, I'll do my best to help. I work in the district attorney's office now, so all my connections are at your service." "Thank you," the woman replied. She told me everything she'd learned and dictated the number she'd written down. "Okay, Cassandra, I get it. It's not a simple matter, but it's solvable. I think after all, for every scumbag there is a more powerful force. I'll try to help, but tell this friend of mine that I'll call him tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, depending on how things turn out, from his phone, and he can take the call." "Thank you, Michael." Without waiting for her ex-husband's retort, Cassandra ended the conversation, which had been very difficult for her, and washed her face with ice water, hoping it would bring her at least a semblance of composure. Still in the process of talking to Michael, she wanted to apologize to him, but she couldn't. The bitter resentment at the man's inattention that had caused her to lose her children still stung the woman's heart. At the same time, Cassandra realized that without the intervention of her ex-husband, who had extensive connections in the area, Thomas's family was practically doomed, and she wanted to keep the boy safe and try to save his parents. For a while, the woman sat in the bathroom, leveling her heartbeat with breathing exercises. Seeing that an hour had practically passed, she returned to Kevin in the kitchen and informed him of what Michael had said. The man texted his friend the information he had received from his wife and hugged Cassandra tightly. He could see how the woman he loved had shrunk in the last hour, and he didn't know how to help her. He wanted to protect her from all adversity. Instead, Cassandra had to turn, as Kevin easily guessed, to the man who had almost destroyed her fate to the ground. The conversation stirred the woman. She released herself from Kevin's embrace and automatically began clearing the table, oblivious to the fact that she was sending her husband's completely untouched food into the bin. Finally, the man intercepted her hand and suggested, "Drop this fuss. It's been a difficult day and we need to rest." Even as she listened to her sleeping husband's measured breathing, Cassandra could not calm down. The images of her babies came to her eyes as if they were real. Stephen and Marcus smiling toothless smiles at her. Then they were going to kindergarten for the first time and leaning against the window, waving their little hands at her. They hand her holiday cards. Here, obviously conspiring, instead of falling asleep, they applaud loudly and unanimously when she begins to sing them a lullaby. How many pleasant moments there had been, so carefully stored, somewhere far away in her memory, and so rudely had everything been crossed out by an accident. How many times she had warned her sons not to take risks, and still they had not listened. What was the use of being angry now, though? Stephen and Marcus are gone. Their father is now the only hope for Thomas to get a hug from his mom in the very near future. At least let this woman, a complete stranger to Cassandra, be able to help Michael. Thomas began to murmur something, and Cassandra slipped out from under her husband's arm and hurried to the boy. She gently adjusted the blanket he had almost thrown on the floor, felt his forehead, fearing he was running a fever, and sighed in relief as she realized that, in her experience, all was well. Thomas opened his eyes and Cassandra sat down on the edge of the sofa and began to hum softly a lullaby. The boy had long since fallen asleep, but the woman remained seated beside him. She was so anxious for the child to return to his parents, and at the same time, she realized that she would desperately miss spending time with him. As the sky, visible through the slit between the curtains, lightened, Cassandra went quietly to the kitchen to make herself some coffee and work on her paperwork, because there was no point in going to bed. In these dawn hours, there might be matters directly affecting Thomas' fate being decided somewhere far away, but Cassandra was powerless to influence anything. She had already done everything she could to overcome her mortal resentment, and now all she had to do was wait for the outcome. After carefully studying the papers, the woman made notes in the margins on a separate sheet of paper, wrote out her suggestions, and carefully tucking them all away in a zipped folder, began to prepare breakfast, trying not to make any noise. She had already decided to ask her boss to excuse her, so as not to tire the boy too much by traveling to unfamiliar places. After waiting for the time to send messages, Cassandra typed to the boss that she would pass the prepared documents through her husband and began to think of something to please the little guest, who of course was worried about the forced separation from his parents, although he tried to keep up his good behavior. When Kevin, who had showered but was still yawning, came into the kitchen, Cassandra had almost everything ready. She invited her husband to the table and asked, "Kevin, stop by on your way to Mr. Jasper's and give him the file for me. I've already warned him that I won't be able to stop by work for a few days, and if there's anything that needs to be reviewed, have him email it to me or pass it on through you. As a last resort, of course, I'll drive up, but I don't want to stress Thomas out. I wanted to go to my mother's house with him and then go to the Children's Entertainment Center so he could have fun playing on the computer, so he wouldn't think about sad things because he was having nightmares at night." Kevin agreed to his wife's plan, and after quickly swallowing his breakfast, he thanked her and started to get ready for work. Thomas woke up much later, but Cassandra had no thought of waking him up. She wanted the boy to be comfortable. The woman fed the child and then suggested, "Let's stop by my mom's for a bit, and then we'll go somewhere to rest." A text message arrived on Cassandra's phone and she smiled when she saw the notification that the money had been credited. Kevin had worried about his wife not having any financial problems. The woman smiled and asked the boy, "Would you like me and you to go to an amusement park? It's not too far from the city, and there are lots of fun things to do there, a laughing room, rope courses, and I think even a climbing wall. Do you like that kind of active entertainment, or maybe you prefer the cinema?" "That's no problem either. I haven't watched a film on the big screen in 100 years. Thomas confessed embarrassedly. "I'd rather go to an amusement park, to be honest." "Well, that's where we're going." Bridget was delighted when her daughter came to see her with the boy. It meant Cassandra believed her husband and didn't rush out and demand the child be placed somewhere because of traumatic memories. She could see that Cassandra seemed to thaw out, even after her brief interaction with Thomas, and barely made them leave as soon as possible. "Daughter, I'm feeling just fine today. Go have fun. If anything, of course, I'll call you, and don't worry at all, really. It's like I even have more energy today after yesterday's walk." Turning to the boy, Bridget asked, "Thomas, I beg you, rest well for you and me." The boy nodded quite seriously and promised. "I'll have Cassandra take pictures and send them to you. You have a state-of-the-art smartphone, don't you?" The woman smiled and praised. "Well done. Great idea. That's right. I'm going to have fun with you. Cassandra, check your phone is charged." Cassandra reassured her mum by saying that she could charge her phone in the car at any time. Soon the guests left Bridget, and she was left alone to dream that her daughter would finally decide to become a mum again. It was obvious to her that Cassandra had a great way with children, but she had suffered for so many years, deliberately avoiding contact with them. "May everything turn out well for my suffering little girl." Bridget prayed aloud, hoping that the plea would be heard upstairs. Cassandra, driving with particular care, drove Thomas out for fun and felt the weight of her willingly assumed responsibility growing on her. The boy had first of all asked to go on the ropes course, and the woman had agreed. Though at the sight of the rope stretched high, she wanted to grab the child in her arms and not let go. Cassandra watched the frolicking child and from time to time took photos, but did not dare to distract herself from sending particularly expressive pictures to her mother. It seemed to her that if she distracted herself for even a few seconds, something bad would happen to the boy. The thought crossed her mind of the degree of desperation Thomas's mum had been in, agreeing to give her son to a near stranger. Such an act could only be dared because of the real threat to the child's life and health. So she, Cassandra, had no right to let down a woman about whom she knew the bare minimum of information: name, surname, age, and the fact that the unfortunate woman and her husband were involved in a story that she could not get out of on her own. Cassandra, however, was in an even more advantageous position. Cheryl, Thomas's mum, knew less about the people who had taken her son in. The fun-filled Monday had flashed by without a second thought. The boy, tired from his many outdoor activities, fell asleep after a hearty dinner and rested peacefully until morning without crying out or waking up. Kevin and Cassandra chatted quietly in the kitchen. The woman spoke enthusiastically about how bravely Thomas had conquered the rides and showed pictures. "Tomorrow I want to take our guest to our museums after his visit to his mother, and then to the cinema or vice versa, as Thomas wants. If you can, come along, it'll be fun. He's so funny and sometimes he has such deep thoughts. He told me today that adults try to look serious on purpose to be feared and not to be picked on. Can you imagine?" The man agreed that there was something reasonable in this inference and suggested, "Cassandra, let's go to bed too, like Thomas, because tomorrow, as I understand it, will be no less busy." Neither Tuesday nor Wednesday brought news from Michael or the boy's relatives. Although the child attended all kinds of entertaining and educational establishments, his mood was getting worse every day. He became increasingly brooding and sad. Kevin and Cassandra realized that the boy was missing his family more and more, but had no influence on the situation. It wasn't until Thursday, when Cassandra and Thomas were visiting Bridget, that the long-awaited phone call came. Michael informed his ex-wife that the main difficulties were over and warned her. "There are still a few things to be resolved, but that's the small stuff. The important thing is that the boy is now safe. His parents are on their way to the town where you live now. I warned them to call you in advance, as they will arrive and clarify the address. Anyway, I'll see this thing through to the final point, of course, so don't worry." Cassandra thanked her ex-husband profusely. "Thank you, Michael, and I'm sorry for everything." The man's voice was ringing as he replied to the woman he had hurt so much. "Cassandra, you have no idea how glad I am to hear from you, even if it is on such an occasion. I wish you happiness, and if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. I'm always happy to help." Cassandra said goodbye to her ex-husband, and Bridget, who had heard her daughter's conversation, couldn't believe her own ears. It seemed her Cassandra had just spoken quite adequately to a man she had once loved dearly and then hated. "Mom, we have to leave. Thomas's parents are on their way and I have to give him a bath." The child realized that he would soon see his mom and dad and started jumping around the room shouting, "Yay!" Cassandra barely managed to keep him quiet. Bridget, happy that the situation had been resolved, gave the boy a souvenir of her photograph in the stamp collection he liked so much. "Here, Thomas, you will look at the album and remember me." The child promised. "Thank you, but I won't forget you, Grandma Bridget, even without stamps." Seizing the moment, Cassandra called her husband to tell him the good news, but it turned out he already knew. "Cassandra, Winston has already told me that thanks to your help, everything has been resolved. I'm taking a taxi home now to get ready for the guests." Cassandra was a little sad to part with the boy who had awakened in her memories of the most joyful days in the company of her sons, and she invited him to visit the toy shop on the way. "You know, I'd really like to get you something too. Choose whatever you want." The boy did not resist, but apparently shy, did not walk for a long time between the racks of toys on display, and soon he took a robot from the shelf, which was not the most expensive. On the way to the checkout, Cassandra put in her basket the aeroplane Thomas had once told her about, and a few more board games. "Oh, there's so much," said the child in surprise. "What a treat today." Cassandra agreed. "Yes, Thomas, it is a very big holiday today." By the time the doorbell rang, the boy was already cleanly bathed, and the cutlery was flaunting on the table. Cheryl, barely over the threshold, rushed to her son, hugging him and showering him with kisses. The boy's father handed Cassandra flowers, and Winston gave Kevin a firm, manly hug. After Thomas, assuming the role of an adult, introduced the parents to the owners of the flat, everyone sat down at the table. Cheryl volunteered to help Cassandra and confessed, "If it weren't for your kindness, I don't know how we would have managed. I don't know how to express my gratitude. My husband and I have raised money to cover the cost of Thomas and your inconvenience." Cassandra turned pale and replied, "Cheryl, put that envelope away immediately. Don't insult me with this act. You have a boy who will be going to school soon, so spend this money on him. And, if you don't mind, send me and my husband a picture of him once in a while. That would be the best thanks." An embarrassed Cheryl burst into tears and hugged Cassandra. When Thomas, concerned about Mum and Cassandra's long absence from the table, peeked into the kitchen, he saw the women roaring, unable to hold back their tears, and began to ask in a mature manner, "What happened? Did you bump, cut, burn?" Cassandra and Cheryl synchronously wiped away their tears. Mum reassured her son, "It's okay, honey. Everything is just fine." Hugging the boy, she picked him up, lifted him up, and spun him around. Cassandra watched the happy people and did not feel envy, but wished that this family had all their troubles in the past. After the guests left, Cassandra trustingly snuggled up to her husband and confessed to him, "You know, I think I'm ready for motherhood. Thomas proved to me that children are the greatest happiness." The man did not change his wife's mind. Soon Cassandra pleased him and Bridget with the news of her pregnancy. Exactly on time and without any complications, the woman gave birth to a daughter. The girl was named Veronica, as a symbol of victory over the terrible situation that had happened to the sister of Kevin's army friend, and victory over the terrible memories of the past. The doors of the operating theater rustled and creaked lightly. A doctor stepped out of them. Amanda jumped up again, looking hopefully at the medic. "Doctor, please don't be silent." She folded her arms across her chest in a pleading gesture. "The chances are 50-50, the doctor finally said, tightening the mask on her chin. "That she'll get out of the pram." Amanda sobbed sorrowfully again. "You have to believe in the best." The doctor tried to cheer up the girl. He was still young, he would recover. And I wanted to believe in the best. Of course, Amanda was worried about her husband's health, but she was more concerned about the loss of the family's main income and the question of who would provide for them now. Edgar rode out of the corridor to meet his wife returning from work. Amanda was not in a good mood. Lately, it had become a constant state for her. She had to get up early, work, do household chores, and still care for her disabled husband. "How was your day?" Edgar asked, taking the bag from the girl. "Disgusting," Amanda said sharply, taking off her coat. Edgar left for the kitchen. He was quite brisk with the pram and could even boast some mobility, if it could be called that. The man moved the bag of groceries to the floor near the refrigerator and began to open the door. He could only put his purchases on the first shelf or the bottom of the door. Amanda snatched the bottle of milk she'd opened on the way out, slammed it down and closed it loosely. It wouldn't leak to the neighbors. "Why are you shouting?" Edgar looked at her. "Would someone wipe it up?" "You." Amanda felt irritated and developed from her husband's helpfulness. He realized his limited functionality, so he tried not to inconvenience his wife. At first, Edgar was even ashamed, but later he accepted his condition and stopped suffering from remorse. "Can you heat it up for yourself?" "I'm tired." Amanda pulled her hair back with her hands and went into her room. The couch creaked faintly. Bleck the cat rubbed against her leg, begging for a treat. Amanda sat relaxed, exhausted, lethargic, and powerless. This wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd married the handsome extreme sportsman Edgar. Now he's deprived of his passion and his income. And she has to work for two, running all over town showing cheap flats to poor families. This was not how Amanda planned to spend her youth. Her husband had been in a wheelchair for 6 months. At first they lived on old savings, but those soon ran out. Amanda put off looking for a job until the last minute. She was scared, and her inner state was against it. By the age of 25, the girl had no experience. She worked part-time shooting for online clothing shops, blogging for a young stylist, although she had a good education in the hospitality industry. From the first days, real estate work seemed to Amanda to be useless, incomprehensible payment, running around, a lot of calls, the need to persuade someone to travel to the objects. What kept the girl in such an unloved place? Charming director and owner of the agency, Michael. He appeared there rarely, but every time it happened, in the office began a semblance of scenes from the film office romance. All the few female staff began to intensively put themselves in order to correct makeup, hairstyles, check manicures, and it was done by both very young girl students, working part-time in their spare time, and an elderly accountant, Cassandra. Amanda, too, fell under Michael's spell. And the more time passed, the wider the gap between her and Edgar grew. She stopped believing in the doctor's prognosis, and it was a thankless task to take a chance. But here he was, next to her, a living, handsome man, Michael. Though not hers yet, but it was only a matter of time. Such thoughts daily swarmed the girl's head. There was a constant struggle between duty, feelings, selfishness, and conscience. And that evening, selfishness and inner whims won. At some point, Amanda realized that she didn't care at all about the opinion of others, that she didn't want to support her invalid husband until his retirement and cross out her whole life with it. She too deserves happiness, deserves the joy of being a girl, not to pull a heavy burden on herself. The decision came instantly. It was strange that such a momentous turn was made on an ordinary sofa in an ordinary city flat on an ordinary March evening. "Are you going somewhere?" Edgar asked, watching his wife pack a pile of things into her bag. "Yes," Amanda nodded briefly. "We're going to your mum's." Edgar raised an eyebrow in surprise and grinned with the corner of his mouth. "What kind of nonsense is that? A daughter-in-law wants to go to her mother-in-law's house by herself. The daughter-in-law is tired of working for two." Amanda threw Edgar's trainers into the bag with a swift throw. The man fell silent, and Amanda just burst into tears. "I can't do this anymore, okay? I can't. I'm beautiful, I'm young, I want romance. I want a decent man by my side, I want care and affection, not to look after an invalid." "Amanda." "I'll get out of the wheelchair," Edgar interrupted her. "The doctors said there was a chance." "Maybe you won't. I'm sick of this." Amanda threw in her bag a couple more t-shirts and zipped it up with a precise motion. "Are you staying at your mom's? We need to live apart for at least a few months. 6 months." "I don't know." They were both silent. Amanda was dumbfounded. Edgar realized that he was being thrown away like an unnecessary thing. Really, what good is such a helpless and useless husband? "And aren't you afraid to hang close to the ground when you're lying on that mattress?" Mate Terrence shoved Edgar in the shoulder, barely landing. "Fear the wolf," the man grinned, laying the foam on the grass so that he could gather it up without getting tangled in the slings. Edgar and Terrence had been taking tourists on extreme tours to the mountains, the Alaska range, for 5 years. The guys had tried everything that could tickle the nerves and make the flesh shake. Rafting, jumping rope, quad biking, long-distance hiking, mountaineering. But Edgar's greatest passion was paragliding. He spent almost the whole summer in the mountains. He flew, tried, learnt, got bumps, wiped his knees on landing. Once he dislocated his elbow, caught his paraglider on a tree, and fell from a height of a couple of meters to the ground. The air of freedom and the glamour of the mountains beckoned the stubborn lad, who flew where others were afraid to go, and stayed under the clouds for so long that his fingers went numb from the cold. Edgar started riding tourists when he was already convinced of his own skill. So the guys worked. Terrence was the driver and organizer. Edgar was the coordinator and implementer of extreme entertainment. For 6 months they earned so much that the remaining 6 months could not work at all. But they didn't. They simply changed the style of traveling, and instead of paragliding, they went snowboarding and skiing with tourists. "Oh dear, finish that stuff you're doing. If you fall from that height, you won't pick up any bones." His mother Cassandra shook her head. But the boy liked to live like that. It was 100 times better than sitting in a stuffy office poking at buttons. Dangerous? So what? It's dangerous to sneeze in a public place these days. So what are we supposed to do? Not go out? Of course not. You've got a great education. Go to the bank, make a career. Mother wouldn't stop. Will the children go to the mountains too? No wife, no kids either. Mom, why are you bothering again? Edgar sighed tiredly. The parent was in her repertoire. Talking about the dangers of paragliding and the frivolity of the tourist business was a regular occurrence, even if it brought in decent money. Edgar met Amanda on a social network. He was bored on a winter evening. The guy scrolled through the newsfeed and came across the page of a pretty girl. Something about this brunette caught the young man's eye. Word by word, they went on a couple of dates. The girl was impressed by Edgar's boldness and passion. He took her on several trips, even offered to take her paragliding. But Amanda refused the altitude. Everything spun quickly, and in less than 6 months he proposed to her. Edgar was not embarrassed that the chosen one is spoiled, somewhat capricious, ambitious. But she always waited at home, cooked delicious salads and dishes, did not criticize his hobbies. At work, Edgar's wife did not kick out the wife. Let her do what she likes, he said to his mother. I earn enough for 2. At least she's always beautiful and fresh. Amanda was more than happy with this arrangement. She was already dreaming of a full-service travel agency, of a house somewhere by the sea, of her own column in some fashion magazine. Life went on at its own pace. Edgar and his wife lived a year and a half. Her mother gave the young couple her 2-room flat, and she bought a small house in the countryside outside the city on her savings and moved in, but on the condition that soon there would be grandchildren. Edgar guffawed. Amanda rolled her eyes. Children were not in her plans for the next 100 years. But it wasn't necessary to upset Cassandra to know that. Instead of children, Amanda suggested that her husband get a Spitz. Edgar didn't mind and promised that after the next tour they would go together to a breeder and choose a puppy. A happy Amanda stayed home in anticipation, and Edgar and Terrence took the tourists to the mountains. Edgar had been warned by everyone that his fascination with flying would not end well. But fate had other plans. The return trip in the mountains fell on rainy weather. In late August, Terence drove the minibus with the group, carefully slowing down on the serpentine corners. Edgar was dozing in the front passenger seat, tired from the busy program and the early rise. It all happened in a split second when a dashing local jigger in his car sped out of the corner and into the oncoming traffic. Terence swerved to the side to avoid the collision. The minibus tipped on its side and slammed into a pole and a concrete barrier. Edgar was literally squeezed in half between the roof and the dashboard. The other passengers were crushed like peas, but fortunately no one else was seriously hurt. They were just abrasions, bruises, contusions, and a couple of broken fingers. Terence dislocated his arm and suffered a concussion. Breathless Edgar was pulled out by rescue personnel only 40 minutes later. In the mountains in the rain and traveling fast is not even possible for rescuers. He was taken to the nearest hospital, but there was no one there to perform the complicated operation. The man was rushed to the state capital. There he could be given at least a chance to get back on his feet. The operation was a success. Edgar recovered quickly, but he was paralyzed from the waist down. Without words, it was clear that extreme sports were over for good, extreme sports and his favorite job. The minibus was beyond recovery. The firm was ruined. It was left without transport and its chief instructor. Amanda howled wolf as she realized her beautiful, comfortable life was over. Her attitude towards her husband changed almost immediately. Whereas before she had seen him as a hero, a pillar, a leader, a risk-taker, now he was just a source of trouble. Edgar experienced the crisis of loss of mobility for a long time. He became depressed. 10 times a day he revisited photos from his trips, pulled the remains of his parachute out of his rucksack, stroked it, holding it in his hands, sighing, staring at one point. The atmosphere in the flat was heavy. The doctor prescribed Edgar a set of exercises that should have had an effect over time. But the man, disgusted by his helplessness, could not start doing them for a long time. Amanda avoided talking about the accident and didn't poke her husband's nose in his deficiency at first. But as the irritation and strain grew, she sometimes snapped. "Don't be discouraged, son. Believe in the best, and do not give up therapeutic gymnastics called to raise morale only Mother Cassandra." Terence, who had recovered, came to visit occasionally. But it was hard for him to talk about what he had lost. As time passed, the former paraglider gradually heeded the doctor's advice and began to exercise occasionally. Just as Amanda began to think about divorce. Amanda had a breakdown at work. It was a frosty morning in the village. Clusters of rowan berries, covered in hoarfrost like earrings, adorned a bald bush. A flock of sparrows hopped in it with a cheerful chirp. Frost covered the ground. Amanda opened the gate and rolled the pram down the narrow path to the porch. Cassandra popped out of the door wearing a down shawl. The two women pulled the pram into the hay. "How long are you visiting, Amanda?" the mother-in-law asked, shaking an invisible speck off her son's jacket. "Edgar, for a long time." "I'm going back to town. I have work to do," Amanda replied briefly. Before Cassandra could even open her mouth, her daughter-in-law hurriedly said goodbye, slammed the door shut, and took a taxi back to catch the train. The women stared at their son in confusion. Edgar was gloomier than a cloud. He had lost his favorite thing, his ability to walk, and now his personal life hung in the balance. A couple of days later, Amanda arrived again. The man was hopeful when he heard the clatter of the wicket outside the windows, but Edgar's joy was too soon. "I've always wanted a dog," Amanda put the carrier with Bill's cat on the floor without even saying hello. The frightened cat huddled in the far corner and mewed hoarsely in fear. Amanda left without even bothering to say goodbye. Edgar felt a little better. The clever animal quickly got used to his new surroundings. The cat often slept on his master's lap while Edgar sat by the window in his pram or outside, breathing fresh air. Sometimes Bleck would jump up and down to catch sparrows in the snow, or hunt for an invisible speck in the dry grass. Edgar loved to watch the pet. It calmed him and drove away his boredom and longing for adventure. 2 months passed. It was the end of March. During that time, Amanda never returned. At first, the man called and wrote to her himself. But as time went on, his wife stopped picking up the phone and answered one-wordedly on social media. Edgar realized that he had been cynically and utterly dispassionately disposed of. Cassandra's mother shook her head and often berated Amanda. Cassandra was especially concerned about the state of the flat her son had left behind. "Good girl," Cassandra lamented. "She left her husband on my neck. She lives in the city in someone else's mansion and doesn't give a damn. Edgar, get a divorce, I'm telling you. And everything will get better. Stop it." The man waved his mother away, but he believed in his own words less and less. Apathy and longing were eating Edgar. He was tormented by his own idleness, because he could not do most of the housework. Walks were rare. Pulling the pram down a couple of porch steps to the ground was hard. Once again, as Cassandra tried to do so, an elderly neighbor, Norman, peered over the fence at her. "Hey Cassandra, what are you going to do? Say you've got him in your arms," shouted the old man in righteous indignation simply. "Hello, Norman," said the woman. "Well, what else could it be? You'd better help than scratch your tongue. The gate is open." The neighbor ran nimbly, not at all senilely, to the pram and helped it down the steps and onto the path to the gate. At the same time, he asked both Edgar and his mother about what had happened. "It's a misfortune." "A misfortune," the man scratched the back of his head, pushing his knitted cap to the side. "And it's not clear whether he'll get up or not." "I'll get up," Edgar mumbled, feeling terribly embarrassed that the two older men had to deal with him. "I've got it." Norman threw up a finger. "I'll come back tomorrow and tell you how to adapt it for the pram. Then you, grandson," he said to Edgar, "can you get in and out? Better get back on your feet, though. Okay?" Edgar smiled a little and sighed. "Norman's not like my grandfather, God rest his soul. A lazy bum," Cassandra exclaimed. "All he knew how to do was stuff holes in socks." The company laughed involuntarily. The neighbor soon left, having inspected the porch beforehand, and Cassandra rolled the pram along the pavement to the shop. Amanda opened her laptop after work, sitting down on the soft couch. She didn't look away from a message from her husband with another question. Camila was interested in something else. Today, Michael, the director of the agency, had finally paid attention to her and invited her to coffee together at lunchtime. It was not for nothing that Camila wore short skirts and spent several hours every morning in front of the mirror. The determination with which Camila moved towards the goal of winning the director was worthy of applause. The girl went with the chief to a coffee shop and made it clear that she would not mind to continue communication in a more informal setting. Michael caught the hint, and at the end of lunch invited the pretty employee to dinner at a restaurant at the end of the week. Camila cheered. "His suit is definitely not from a local tailor," Camila mumbled under her breath as she looked at her boss's photos on social networking sites. "And a decent watch and cufflinks." Her eyes burned with admiration, but more for herself. A month had passed since Camila had put her husband in her mother-in-law's care, and during this time she realized that her life was, in general, not so bad. The work suddenly stopped stressing her. Cooking and cleaning turned into rare worries. There was enough money for herself, and still had time to shoot for clothing catalogs. Sometimes on the mental horizon slipped thoughts of divorce, but so far Camila canceled them. It was necessary to prepare the ground for a run-up, so as not to sit soft place in a puddle. As a calculatingly cunning woman, Camila understood this, and therefore did not hurry. Though Edgar could have served Edgar at any moment. But she would think of something. Yes, and not much believed Camila that kind attached to her Edgar first will go to such a step. The photos of the boss told Camila what she wanted to know. Michael in his 35 years was the owner of a nice house in the suburbs, 2 cars, and clearly had a passion for business things, foreign tailoring. The girl leaned back contentedly on the back of the sofa, scrolling in her head options for outfits for a future date. Her sick husband and the fact that she was legally married did not slow Camila down a bit. She didn't give a damn. X-Day came. Michael picked her up in his car. Since her work in the agency, Camila tried not to spread much about her personal life. She'd taken off her ring right after she'd sent Edgar to the country, and therefore in the car already flirted with her boss, who was 10 years older than her. The girl achieved her goal. In the morning, she woke up in the house of her lover. Michael brought her coffee and asked if the young lady does not want to go to the skating rink. A couple of days later, Camila flirtatiously agreed. Everything went according to plan. She told Michael what he wanted to hear, and he was slipping into an affair with his coworker. At work, they decided not to advertise their relationship, although it was difficult to hide something in a female team. Soon the whole office was talking about the fact that the manager had a young mistress. Camila quietly laughed at the gossiping colleagues, but did not hurry to reveal the secret. Her goal was Michael, not to hurt the noses of her workmates. The first day of April was too warm. It was as if the sun had reached the clear sky and was now eager to make all the plants grow and bloom in one day. There were even some sleepy flies in the air, dazed by the sudden joy of plus 19 degrees. Norman scratched his stubbled chin and held his visor up, looking at the sun. "It's blooming, isn't it?" He nodded to Edgar. The man sat in his buggy on the porch path, keeping his neighbor company while he reworked the sides into a strong and smooth slope. On Edgar's lap, Black the cat stomped around. He was writhing in pain, digging his paws into his master's lap. "Now we'll put some paste on it, and you'll ride like a racer," the elderly neighbor said contentedly, wielding a hammer. "At least we can do it without breaking traffic laws," Edgar smiled. He'd been a little perked up lately. Maybe it was the weather, maybe it was the fact that Amanda had practically abandoned him. Either way, clarity had come. Besides, Edgar had figured out a way to brighten up his hated idleness. He decided to write a book about his journey to paraplegia. He found a blank notebook in his desk and began jotting down ideas. Edgar had never written any texts before, except for essays at school. However, his work was quite vigorous. It was the abundant reading in the winter evenings, as his mother had always favored books and had plenty of them at home. On those same winter evenings, he and his parents, sometimes with neighbors or alone in the kitchen, would read across from each other while drinking herbal tea. At such times, Edgar would forget that he was deprived of the ability to walk and become a little happier. Black stretched his striped back, jumped to the ground, and disappeared behind the fence on some feline business of his own. "It's done." Norman surveyed the job well done, and then turned to Edgar. "Come on, son, try it yourself." Edgar, helping himself with his hands, began to carefully roll the pram up the makeshift ramp. A few minutes later, he and his vehicle were already at the door to the house. "Well, that's good," praised his neighbor. "Grandpa, are you here?" Came from behind the fence. "Let's go to lunch. I boiled some brine soup." Edgar turned his head at that voice, which sounded like the crunch of thin ice on a puddle. A girl in a striped jumper was waving from behind the gate. Her blonde curls were poking out from under her beret, and her bright blue eyes were visible, even at a distance of several meters. "My granddaughter," Elizabeth. Norman nodded discreetly to Edgar. "She's in town for the weekend studying. I don't know who she's studying for," said the old man. "Come on, Grandpa, let's go. It's getting cold." The guest stomped her foot demandingly outside the gate. I'm coming. Why are you shouting?" The neighbor waved good-naturedly at her. "I'll go." "Edgar, say hello. I'll see you again. That beam under the roof is bad. It could use a change." Norman gathered the tools in a bag, waved to Edgar, and went out the gate to his granddaughter. The man thanked his neighbor for his hard work, and suddenly realized that he couldn't stop thinking about Elizabeth, even though he hadn't even met her. April continued to bring warmth and wind. There were sparse gray-white piles of snow in the flower beds, and among them were sprouts of the first spring flowers sticking out of the ground. Edgar hadn't written to Amanda for a long time, but he was actively working on his book. The second notebook was already written. "Edgar, can you get to the shop by yourself?" "Are you out of salt?" Mother shouted from the kitchen. "I can't leave. The pies will burn and the soup will run away," Edgar said. The way to the grocery store was simple, a straight asphalt path about 250 meters long, with no steps and no potholes. "I can make it," Edgar said. He hastily put on his jacket, checked the change in his pocket, and rolled toward the gate. Glad that he could help at last, it was time to go for a walk. His mother looked at him from the window. The tires of the pram rustled quietly on the already dry asphalt. Edgar moved slowly, looking at the village. In the gray and dreary winter, it was depressing. But when the sun came out, The carved shutters and skates on the roof shone. In front of the yard's colored borders and future flower beds looked out. Quick sparrows were dragging grain from the chickens' feeders, chirping. Somewhere sheep barked. The noise pleased the heart, heralded the arrival of warmth to people and animals. Edgar got to the shop without any problems, bought salt and rolled back. Almost back to the house, he heard the pitiful, familiar meows from the roof of the neighbors. The man looked up. Bill was sitting on the roof. Edgar had seen from the window that the cat used to climb up there on scaffolding. The neighbors were repairing something in the attic, and the scaffolding had been up there most of the winter. But the repairs were over. The scaffolding was removed so as not to clutter up the flower bed in front of the windows. And the poor cat was trapped. There was no tree nearby, no lower roof, no suitable fence to climb down. Unhappy Bill climbed into the attic to the neighbors, fell asleep there the night before, and in the morning they cleaned up the scaffolding. And now the frightened animals, seeing the owner, shrieked at the top of their voices that the poor man was stuck. "How are we going to film you now?" "That's the problem." Edgar looked questioningly at the pet. He tried knocking and calling the neighbors, but they weren't home. Apparently, Edgar's conscience prevented him from calling his mother. The feeling of helplessness and inferiority came again. The man looked at the pram with dislike. If it hadn't been for her, I'd have climbed over the fence in no time, used the tools I had on hand to get up on the roof, and lowered Bleak down to the ground, he thought. A familiar ringing voice snapped Edgar out of his musings. Norman's granddaughter, Elizabeth, was standing nearby, looking up at the roof. "Yes, I wonder how to get it." Edgar nodded cautiously. "Well, you don't have much to think about," Elizabeth said. "Well, we can't leave the mustache in the lurch." She put the bag of food in Edgar's lap, rolled up her sleeves, and climbed over the fence to the neighbors. The man only clapped his eyes in amazement. The vivacious girl aroused in him a feeling of real admiration. Elizabeth walked round the house and found an old 3-step ladder by the shed. She shook the find happily, showing Edgar that she had an idea. The ladder was low enough to climb onto the roof, but high enough to reach her hands over the edge and grab the cat's paw. The frightened Bill clawed at the girl's hand, meowed, and looked around with bulging eyes. When the animal was on the ground, Elizabeth handed it directly into the hands of its owner, through the hole between the bars of the fence. Then she carefully carried the ladder back to its place and climbed back over the fence as deftly as she had done the first time. There was no sign of the sudden intrusion. "You made us do a lot of work." She knelt down in front of Edgar and patted the cat's fur affectionately. "Thank you. I don't know how I would have got it myself." Edgar handed the girl a bag of groceries. "My name is Elizabeth," by the way she introduced herself. Obviously not, or he would have waited for another kind-hearted passerby. "And I'm Edgar." The man smiled slightly. "It's a good thing it was you," he said to the passerby. Elizabeth wrinkled her nose. "Let's go with you. Why not? It's like we're old acquaintances." "I'm just embarrassed," Edgar said. "I must be about 10 years older than you." "We look the same age," Elizabeth said. "How about just being polite?" "That's right," Edgar agreed. He drove forward a little and stopped at his gate. "Let me help you." Elizabeth reached for the handle to open the door so Edgar could drive through freely. She took a careless step and tripped over the curb ledge. The man's reaction was lightning fast. He lunged forward and picked Elizabeth up with his arms. I'm clumsy, she deftly hid her embarrassment behind a laugh. "It happens to everyone. It's all right," Edgar played along. "Elizabeth, come and have tea with Grandpa Norman." "Of course we will." Grandpa said something about the roof. Elizabeth remembered and nodded. She waved goodbye and went on her way. Edgar, for some reason, was as excited as a child. He rolled the pram onto the porch, opened the door to the house, where a hungry Bill immediately ran out. It was only then that he realized what had happened a minute ago. For the first time since the accident, the man felt his legs weakly as he pitched forward. They echoed with a slight tingling in his knees. Amanda stretched out in bed, rays of sunlight falling through the window. The hands on the clock showed around 10. Michael wasn't around, he always left early. Apart from weekends, work was the most important lady in the real estate agency director's life. Amanda was in no hurry to get to work. She was already thinking of quitting in general. She was annoyed that Michael wasn't suggesting it. After all, in fact, they were already in a relationship, and he could also allocate some money for her. When colleagues called with questions about his readiness to show flats to buyers, Amanda always found excuses: illness, fatigue, busyness, urgent trip. If he doesn't offer, then I have to quit, Amanda decided as she waited for the coffee machine to make coffee. She liked Michael's house much better than her husband's flat. It was quiet, spacious, and every little thing was taken care of by a robot Hoover. Dishes are washed by a machine, and everything else is automated to the max. It's also perfectly clean. Once a week, Michael had his house cleaned by a cleaning company. He couldn't stand dirt and piles of junk, and he preferred dry cleaning, where all the clothes were put on a hanger and returned perfectly ironed. Unlike Edgar, he was always on parade, not hanging around with tourists, looking after himself. It all appealed to Amanda. It was the way she'd always wanted to live. That was the level she aspired to. The first part of the plan had already been realized. She'd become the boss's mistress. The next part was to gradually accustom him to her in her personal space. Amanda was already looking ravenously at Michael's second car, calculating whether she needed a fur coat for the next season, and when it would be better to take a holiday. And then, when everything was already taken care of, she would quietly divorce Edgar. The girls' plans were Napoleonic. At work, they began to suspect a connection with the boss when Michael drove her a couple of times. Amanda did not answer the questions, but only joked, rolled her eyes. When it all came out, she wouldn't care. In the meantime, it would be better to keep the affair a secret, at least not to be jinxed. Amanda ate a leisurely breakfast, showered, put on makeup, hailed a taxi, and left the office in full parade. She was sure it would encourage Michael to do something more decisive, such as asking her to move in with him at last. "Greetings," Amanda said to the manager, raising an eyebrow in mild amazement. "Not for work anymore." She placed the application sheet in front of her. "So, are you going freelance or have you already found a better place?" the manager asked, putting the application in the folder. You could say that Amanda smiled enigmatically. She didn't bother with the detentions at her former job, hastily picked up her things from her desk, bade a dry farewell to her colleagues, and dashed out into the street. It was amazing the determination Amanda had awakened when the prospect of a relationship with a wealthy man loomed, and how she dreaded being left in poverty with a disabled husband. Amanda drove home, dropped off her belongings from work. Then she called her friend Camilla, and they went shopping together. The enterprising girl decided that a new set of pretty lingerie would soften the news of her dismissal from Michael. In the evening, Amanda met her lover in parade at his home and informed him of her decision. Quit. But why? You didn't seem to be loaded with cases, and you were always paid on time. The man was not naively surprised. Why, Michael? Amanda coquettishly sat on his lap. To spend more time with you. After all, a well-slept, beautiful, satisfied woman is better than a tired working bee, isn't she? Yeah. Well, what makes you think you were? Michael was genuinely perplexed. That's how I felt. Amanda didn't like her lover's reaction. An awkward silence ensued. The man was the first to break it. I wanted to talk to you about the May holidays too. I thought maybe we could go to the mountains, rent a remote cozy house. What do you think? The word mountains almost made Amanda cringe. She was fed up with the mountains in her life with Edgar, and therefore quickly catching her face, the girl with the most innocent voice began to dissuade Michael from his decision. Michael, it can still be cold in the mountains. I want to get warm already, you know. She slightly played with her eyebrows. Maybe we should spend a little more and fly to a place where it's already warm enough. Lying on the beach is better than kicking up mud in the woods, don't you think? We could do that, the man agreed and reached for his laptop to look for a suitable offer. Amanda realized she'd won. Edgar was looking forward to the tea party with the neighbors, as if it were some kind of important event. He was also very excited by the return of the weak sensitivity in his legs. Had the hope of flying again risen from the ashes? Or at least to walk with his feet on the grass? Edgar longed for the paraglider, the mountains of his active life. He had buried it all when he got into the pram. But now there was a glimpse of a chance in the darkness that not all was lost. Edgar found the doctor's appointment folder, studied the instructions for physical therapy, and began to slowly exercise. Cassandra even let out a quiet tear of joy as she watched her son exercise. She tried to support him in everything, but not to push or nag him. She realized what Edgar was going through physically and mentally, and so she lagged behind with questions about Amanda, about motivation, about the flat. Time will come on its own, everything will work out as it should, the woman sometimes said to herself in the evenings, tapping her knitting needles against each other. On a warm afternoon in mid-April, Norman and Elizabeth appeared on the doorstep of the house. The landlady invited them in, but the brisk grandfather waved them away, saying that first work, then tea and talk. So he surveyed the edge of the roof and set to work. Cassandra fussed at first, but then waved goodbye and went off to make dumplings. Edgar and Elizabeth set up on the front porch in case the good neighbor needed to fetch tools. "That's a great-grandfather you have, Elizabeth," Edgar whispered in the girl's ear. "I don't remember my grandfathers. I was a little boy when they were gone. I guess I was lucky." Elizabeth nodded and smiled as she looked at her relative who was hard at work with a hammer. "And yes, you're right, my grandfather is a good man. An example for the whole family in hard work and optimism." "I can see that," Edgar agreed. "Do you look like him?" Elizabeth tilted her head slyly and looked down at Edgar. She rested her hand on the wheel of the pram. "What is it?" She looked at the boy expectantly. Edgar was embarrassed for some reason. His heart was pounding like crazy. This simple and perky student caused in him a feeling similar to the first flight under the dome of a paraglider. "You're light, witty, and kind," Edgar said in one breath. Elizabeth felt as if she were experiencing all the words in turn, and then nodded affirmatively, nodded a little pictorially, gave Edgar a playful tap on the shoulder, and laughed. An hour later, vanilla and cherries wafted from the open kitchen window. Cassandra leaned out the door and called out to everyone. "Give up that roof, Norman. And you guys, come and eat your dumplings while they're hot." Edgar and Elizabeth were chatting on a bench near the porch and did not even hear the hostess' response at first. "You, Cassandra, should have your stomach full of people when you're in the middle of work," the elderly neighbor said, fiddling with his tools. "Grandfather, let's not go. It will get cold," Elizabeth said softly. She grabbed the handles of the pram with Edgar and boldly rolled it down the porch to the entrance. "Don't do that, will you?" "I'll do it myself," he protested. "Let me take care of you," Lisa giggled but didn't stop. When the two of them went to wash their hands in the back of the house, Cassandra stopped Norman, who was late for the young people, at the threshold and whispered, "There's a flower in bloom." "I can't see it," he mumbled good-naturedly. "Do you take me for an old fool?" The neighbors smiled understandingly. When the whole company was gathered round the table, the plates were already steaming, fresh with jam, homemade dumplings with garden cherries, strong tea and sour cream so thick that a spoon could stand in it. Under the table, Bill grumbled. The cat nosed on one lap or the other, begging for treats. In the end, Elizabeth quietly gave the mustached cat one dumpling. Bill instantly dragged his prey outside with a proud look. "Who is it that feeds the cat from the table?" Cassandra was outraged. "Cassandra, will you send them for a walk as punishment?" Grandpa Norman winked at his granddaughter. Elizabeth and Edgar looked at each other at the same time. "That's right," said the landlady. "The weather's nice, there's no need to sit around. Go and pick a bunch of flowers. The goose meadow has already appeared. There's a whole meadow behind the village by the pond, and there's a path for the pram, just enough for Edgar to get through." After the meal, Elizabeth and Edgar, sensing a trick, but not seeing it, were outside the gate of the house and moved leisurely along the path. "Can't you walk at all?" "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked that. It's inappropriate." "It's okay," Edgar answered very calmly. "The doctors say there's a chance, but I can't walk yet." At the same time, he remembered the tingling in his knees. He had recently started doing his own exercises, gymnastics, to restore sensation. But sometimes apathy overcomes me and I want to give up and accept everything he shared with the girl. They say that human possibilities are limitless, and it's all about desire. Elizabeth looked at the sun and then at Edgar. I'm studying marketing, but I want to work with people, with the masses. I feel a calling, but I don't know in what way. That's great, Edgar complimented her. In time, you'll realize where you're going. And you'll get back on your feet in time. I know you will. Elizabeth smiled and discreetly touched the man's shoulder. Edgar felt the warmth of her hand even through the thick sweatshirt. It remained there, even when the hand itself was gone. They talked and talked about plans and dreams, about the shortcomings of the student dormitories and strict teachers, about the countryside and the city, about the joys of being and imaginary problems. For the first time in many months after the accident, Edgar felt alive. If his legs would have obeyed, he would have run, spreading his arms out to the sides and putting his face to the wind. The pram hit a rock, rattling lightly. When the wheels shuddered, Elizabeth stopped. Does it hurt? No, he looked up at her, bewildered by the sudden joy. I think I can feel my leg. Her eyes widened, and she squatted down beside him. She grasped her leg just above the knee and pressed lightly. The skin responded to Edgar with a barely perceptible but uncomfortable, dull pain, as if through a pillow. Barely, but it echoed. Edgar grabbed Elizabeth's hand. I can feel her, he whispered. I can feel her exactly. Elizabeth jumped up and laughed, then threw her arms around Edgar, a tear running down his cheek, either from joy or happiness, or maybe both. Amanda was dozing in her chair with her headphones on. Michael was sitting next to her, looking at something on his laptop. Clouds flashed in the window. The plane was carrying them home from their holiday. Amanda was pleased, and mostly with herself. She had persuaded her lover abroad to buy some expensive gifts. The arguments were persuasive. I really need it, and it will be more expensive at our place anyway. Michael didn't argue, but somehow he didn't have the joy of gift-giving on his face. Although Amanda was diligently broadcasting to the entire shop, glowing defiantly and kissing the man on the cheek. Michael himself never started a conversation about moving, despite the fact that the girl did not work, but he occasionally hinted at the need to find a new source of income. Amanda sincerely did not understand these hints, although she pretended to be a fool. In the end, she moved her things to Michael's house and appeared in the flat only occasionally. As the couple rested after the morning flight and drank coffee on the balcony, Amanda glanced again at Michael's second car. I was thinking that I could drive, she said. Where to? Michael looked at her questioningly, taking his eyes off the phone screen and his work correspondence. Shopping, errands, fitness. Amanda began to curl her fingers. You can't do much in heels, so in trainers or boots. It's more comfortable. Michael shrugged. And it's easier than buying and registering a car. Why buy a car when you already have one? Amanda nodded down at the blue foreign car. Michael followed her gaze, pressed his lips together, and after a pause said, The car's not running. I'm waiting for a new engine. Then I was planning to repair it, sell it, and invest the money in a project. And by the way, you don't even have any driving experience. You can gain experience, Amanda said. You can always sell it. I liked her so much. I could be your sober driver after all. Amanda was an excellent bargainer. She'd learned while studying to be a translator that it was easier to ask for something than to make the effort and strain herself. And awkwardness could always be smoothed over with a woman's tricks. So Michael rubbed the bridge of his nose irritably with his fingers. I don't drink, and even if I did, I could call a taxi. The car's not running, no one can drive it. When the right engine comes along, I'll order it. But until then, you'd better buy yourself a good pair of trainers, he said. The man stood up, took the mug with the rest of the coffee and went back to his room, signaling that the subject was closed. Amanda pouted resentfully. The recommendation seemed insulting to her, considering that pretty shoes and stiletto boots had helped her initially win her lover. She was not refused directly, but rather harshly. She remembered the patient, kind Edgar, who, though he couldn't give her a car, had never refused her other more modest gifts. A few days passed. Amanda decided to ignore Michael's refusal and try to talk about the car again later. She pretended to be a diligent housewife, cooked a nice dinner, bought some good wine. The evening passed in a cozy atmosphere, until Michael suggested watching a new film that showed the serene life of a family with 2 children. The father was playing frisbee with his son. The mother was teaching her daughter to play the piano. A golden retriever snoozed on the mat. "I always wanted a big family," 2 Michael said suddenly. "A son and a daughter. I even started this business so that the children would have enough to live on and not need anything." Amanda, who was lying on his lap, was slightly shaken, but she did not show it. So there it was, the perfect image of a spouse for Michael, whom he would agree to provide for without question, an educated, working mom. No, she's not going to be that. Wasting her youth and beauty on children, when there are so many countries, so many cool leisure options and ways to improve yourself. "I feel sick," Amanda said, jumping up and going into the kitchen. Suddenly, she had an amazing idea on how to get all the benefits of a lover without cheating on herself. She opened a bottle of mineral water, poured the falling liquid into a glass and drank contentedly. The plan was simple and ingenious. Elizabeth would only come to the village on weekends. For the rest of the time, she had to attend classes. Edgar missed the girl, but tried to keep himself busy in her absence. He was especially focused on writing his book and doing exercises to develop his legs. Elizabeth supported his zeal in both endeavors. In the first 2 weeks of exercise, Edgar was able to wiggle his toes. In another week, he was able to slightly tilt his foot and tense his lower leg. With each new accomplishment, it was as if the motivation and strength for life was returning. May came. Birds sang, tulips, bushes, greenery, and fresh leaves bloomed. Cassandra was digging in the flower bed. She loosened the soil, removed fallen branches from the birch tree where red, yellow, and white tulip buds leaned. Next to them, crocuses climbed out in a row, and at the very border, blue caps of muscari buds. Bill was hanging around. The cat galloped around with his tail between his legs, jumped on the brick walls, hunted for soldier beetles that flew out from under the slate. Edgar sat in the pram by the porch, his eyelids closed, basking in the sun. Suddenly, someone's hands were on his eyelids. "What's the matter?" He stretched out, more amused than annoyed. "Elizabeth, did you think I wouldn't recognize you?" There was a giggle, and then Cassandra's chuckles. "I'm sneaking around like a gorilla," and he's like, "What's the big deal?" Elizabeth indignantly started tickling Edgar's ribs. He laughed immediately, shaking off the remnants of slumber. Cassandra laughed as well, watching the children fool around. When the fun subsided, they went inside to eat cold okroshka and drink dried fruit compote. At the table, Edgar discreetly put his hand on Elizabeth's arm. When his mother was at the cooker, pouring the compote, Elizabeth looked at him embarrassed, but did not remove her hand. Instead, she stroked his little finger with her thumb. It was a strange embarrassment to her normally perky nature. Edgar himself felt like a teenager, as if he were back at the institute and timidly seeking first dates with pretty female classmates. Cassandra saw what was going on at the table out of the corner of her eye, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she thought of something urgent to do outside, grabbed her head, and dashed out of the kitchen. "Elizabeth, I have to talk to you." Edgar began when he realized they were alone. The girl nodded and turned to face him, her whole body on the stool. "About what?" "About what's going on between us." Edgar sighed and took her hand again. "I like you a lot. I realize that we're not just friends anymore. You've become important to me, and you're helping me not to give up. I realize you don't want an invalid, but I'll tell you anyway, I'm married." Yeah, she dumped me like I wasn't worth having around, but officially, I'm still married. Instead of answering, Elizabeth moved closer and hugged him tightly around the neck. "Of course I need you for anything, and I'm sure you'll be out of that damn chair very, very soon," she whispered in his ear. Edgar's insides warmed. He hugged Elizabeth back, at the same time feeling the distinct tingling in his knees again as he pulled her to him. "You are an amazing person, with a good heart and a beautiful dream." Elizabeth looked into his eyes. "And I care first and foremost about how you feel. not what the papers say. The man smiled and hugged the girl again. Let's get you back on your feet already. Elizabeth kissed him on the cheek. Everything will work itself out from here. Amanda scrambled out of her seat and ran desperately to the lavatory. Under Michael's surprised gaze, they had just sat down to breakfast Saturday morning. They planned to drive to a business meeting and go for a walk afterwards. Are you all right? Michael knocked excitedly on the bathroom door. Yeah, just dizzy all of a sudden with nausea, Amanda replied, carefully mimicking the appropriate sounds. She made some more noise with the cistern drain, the tap, splashed water on her face, and went out into the corridor. Michael looked at her with a mixture of joy and anticipation. Are you pregnant? He blurted out. Oh, I don't know. I'll take a test today, Amanda clutched her forehead. What's there to do? Michael picked her up and sat her on the living room couch, fanning her. It's pretty clear. You're sick of food and your face is all bloomy. And if that's the case, would you be glad? Amanda pulled on the most naively righteous expression she could muster. Are you kidding? Of course I am. Michael knelt down in front of her. I've wanted kids for so long. And I applied for a second degree. What are we going to do? Take it back? Amanda changed from righteousness to a broken expression. Why take it back? You're a correspondence student. I'll pay for your education so you can work when the baby grows up, Michael assured her. Yeah, that's how I went to work. Amanda mentally regained her footing, of course. Good. I'll go to the doctor tomorrow and find out everything. She sighed, hugging a jubilant Michael. How to fake a pregnancy until the belly appeared. Amanda had thought through the nausea, mood swings, dizziness and bouts of appetite. It wasn't a problem. A doctor she knew for a fee could write certificates and reports for the first time. But then Amanda was going to stage a miscarriage. The only problem was how to divorce Edgar discreetly, but stay in his flat. After all, the ambitious woman had plans to marry Michael, but he thought the flat belonged to Amanda. He never allowed her to move in. He wouldn't kick his baby mama out on the street, though, would he? There goes the puzzle, thought the cunning Amanda. The certificate was soon obtained. Michael was jubilant, developed a flurry of activity, and was already choosing a name for the future child. He immediately moved Amanda permanently to his place. In the evenings, he looked through prams and cots, endlessly discussed everything related to children. The girl nudged and herself tried to catch the moment to file for divorce. It remained to quietly finish the story with Edgar, so that it would be possible to marry Michael unhindered. There wasn't much time left, and every day counted. In the meantime, Amanda was taking full advantage of her position. She was capricious, demanded a personal masseur, demanded to order food at home, but at 3 o'clock in the morning asked to buy a ring or a handbag. Michael fulfilled all her requests without question, even made a separate bank card for Amanda. After all, the wishes of a mother and her child were a man's law. And no matter what, he liked Amanda, despite her temper. Are you sure? Elizabeth looked at Edgar very carefully. Maybe we should wait. I don't want anything to happen. Yes, I'm sure. Edgar leaned on the armrests of his chair as hard as he could. It was time to try it. They were both in the living room of the house, on the carpet. Elizabeth stood beside the pram and held out her arms to the man. Edgar began to carefully stand up. At first his legs obeyed him on his elbows, but somehow sluggishly, with a third of the strength that was usual for a healthy man. His knees bent like weighted hinges that hadn't opened a door in a long time. It's heavy, Edgar muttered. Elizabeth watched the boy eagerly. It's harder than learning to walk as a child. He put one foot down on the floor first, felt the shaggy pile of the carpet as if through a pillow. Then he put the other foot down. He had to make up his mind and let go of the armrests of the pram. Doubt overwhelmed the mind. Edgar closed his eyes and remembered his first paragliding flight, an eagle around the clouds that hugged the slopes affectionately, overgrown with pines, fir trees. He shivered at the long-forgotten sensations. He felt Elizabeth's support and tried to take a step. His leg felt like a stranger's, stricken with a cramp, but nevertheless he moved slowly forward. A movement, a step through the force, another step. His back was remembering what it was like to be straight, Edgar looked at his legs, scarred from his many extreme activities, and it was as if he was reliving them all a second time, standing here on the soft carpet in his own home. The man managed to take a dozen feeble steps with Elizabeth's encouragement and, tired, sat back in his chair. "You're doing an incredible job," the girl hugged him. "Let's go to the doctor. Let them record your progress. Maybe he will give some recommendations to make the process go faster." "That's a good idea. But how do we get to the city and the hospital?" Edgar nodded sadly at the still-needed wheelchair. "Norman has a car. He can drive it," Elizabeth suggested. "No, he won't, will he?" Edgar waved his hands. "Norman has already done so much for me. I can't. My conscience won't allow it." "Oh, stop it," Elizabeth threw at him. "That grandfather doesn't understand anything. Yeah, he's old and clueless." Edgar was embarrassed. "But only if he agrees, don't insist." He grabbed the palm of Elizabeth's hand, who was about to go to the grandfather. The old Jigalanok drove measuredly over the bumps of the village road. Norman spun the steering wheel and talked about the years of dashing youth and work in the collective farm. Edgar sat in the back seat, holding a folder with his documents. The pram rode in the back in the boot. Elizabeth chortled in the front passenger seat as she listened to her grandfather's stories. It all happened simply, quickly, and completely easy. She asked for it, and they drove. At least Edgar had time to call the hospital and find out if the surgeon would see him today. "Well, my dear fellow, you know how to surprise me." The doctor raved about Edgar after the examination. "At this rate, in 6 months you will be able to run." "Really?" Elizabeth, who was also present in the room, couldn't resist asking. "Of course, this is the first time I've seen patients recover so quickly from such injuries. It's a miracle. Although in scientific circles they don't say so." The doctor pointed at Edgar's medical records, then at his legs. "Keep up the exercises. Work on regaining mobility in all parts of his legs. I recommend that you try walking with support." Edgar drove back almost elated. He was confident that very soon he would be able to walk again, but also to fly. It was in this mood that the man received a sudden phone call. "Edgar." Hi, Amanda's voice came through the receiver. "I won't be long. Can you talk?" "Hi. What's wrong?" A lump rose in his chest, and with it came the memories that had almost stopped bothering him. "I filed for divorce," Amanda informed him briefly. "I don't think I need to explain why or why not. You're a big, smart boy. You'll figure it out." "Yes, I will," he confirmed his ex-wife's words. "Good. I hope they do it quickly. I'll be out of the flat in a couple of weeks." Amanda hung up after that. Elizabeth heard the conversation, unlike Edgar. "It's for the best. Don't be upset," she turned to Edgar and whispered. "You said yourself that she was just a formality." "You're right," the man nodded. "Still, I loved this man once." The key word is once upon a time. Amanda tapped her fingers contentedly on the arm of the chair. Everything was going according to plan. Edgar had agreed to the divorce, even though he didn't have much of a choice. Michael adored her. The pregnancy legend was confirmed by a certificate. A personal bank card with enough money for every whim at any time of day. Awesome. What more could one want? Amanda felt like a queen, with everyone she'd used in her pursuit of the perfect life dancing in formation in front of her. So what do we have left? Staring pensively at the ceiling, she popped a cherry from the platter on the table. A car and an official marriage, she said to herself, spitting out the pit of the fruit. That's what we'll do tonight. In the evening, when Michael returned home, the first thing he did was to hug Amanda and stroke her belly. The girl was waiting for him. She fed her lover a delicious dinner, poured him wine, and gave him a massage. When Michael relaxed, Amanda went on the attack. "Michael, you know, I really want the baby to be born in a legal marriage. I grew up in a full family myself, and I think fatherlessness is unacceptable." "I agree too," the man nodded. "I wanted to discuss this issue too." Amanda stood waiting, like a hound waiting for the command to hunt down a bird for its master. Instead of answering, Michael reached into the pocket of his briefcase, pulled out a box, and placed it in Amanda's hands. "I wanted to make it pretty, but since we're talking, why not?" Michael pulled his lover to him, kissing her forehead. I agree. Amanda threw her arms around Michael, admiring the size of the stone in the ring. They decided to get married in 3 months. By the time of the wedding, Amanda had already planned to get rid of her ex-husband. After the ceremony and banquet, a week would pass and she would induce a miscarriage. The trap should slam shut in time and securely. I'll have to put on a few kilos for the good life, the girl smirked, mentally continuing to listen to Michael's musings about the wedding. Surprisingly, he was hardly interested in Amanda's personal life. Before she'd met him, she didn't even remember whether she'd told him about the divorce proceedings or not. Apparently, nonsense like an ex-husband was so insignificant to Michael that he preferred not to spend any time or attention on it. Amanda realized it was time to push harder. Michael, when my belly grows big, it will be hard for me to go to the hospital and to do things. She put her head on her lover's chest. Maybe you'll think about a car. And so I would take a couple of lessons with an instructor to refresh my knowledge in my head. What do you say? Of course, Amanda was lying. She didn't have anything to refresh her mind, because she'd got her license through a big acquaintance and obviously not for free. The young lady was not intimidated by the road, the police, or other drivers. The prestige of owning her own foreign car blinded her eyes. Maybe your words make sense? Michael wondered. He put his hands behind his head and wrinkled his forehead. Amanda held her breath and looked up from under her lashes. All right, he finally announced his decision. Only we're going to do things differently. I'll sell this car and buy you something more feminine, okay? Sure, thanks, honey. Amanda squealed in pleasure and started hugging Michael again, wondering if she should buy a new watch or bracelet in honor of such important events as marriage and the car. You should go into town and get that tramp stuff out of the flat. Cassandra put a plate of hot soup in front of her son. You've been divorced for a fortnight and you still haven't. Outside, the window smelled of lilacs. June was buzzing with young grass and summer rains. The sun was lavishing light on the land. Mum, I'm not quite confident enough to drive myself yet, Edgar replied, opening a jar of sour cream. Over the past month, the man had made noticeable progress in regaining his legs. He could get up and sit down with support, could walk slowly around the house with crutches, walked along the wall without support, and tried to keep his back straight. Could you ask Elizabeth? She goes into town every Monday anyway, if she could help you, the woman advised, sitting down across from him at the table. I don't feel comfortable. She's already here with me all the time, like a carer, Edgar mumbled. Cassandra put her hand on his palm. Son, this girl loves you. Unlike the city girls, you don't blow it. Such girls are worth their weight in gold. The boy looked at his mother in agreement. Edgar realized that everything had been clear between him and Elizabeth for a long time. So why did he hesitate and wait for something? Maybe the proverbial pram was still preventing him from stepping forward, even mentally. Many people have a bad first pancake, but that doesn't mean you can't try again. His mother walked round the table, stroked the back of his head, and went out into the room. Edgar ate his soup, then pulled out his phone and dialed Elizabeth's number. Hi, I was wondering if you'd go into town with me any day soon and check out the flat. The guy spoke, nervously twirling his spoon. For some reason, every interaction with Elizabeth gave him a pleasant shiver. Edgar was shy, lost, everything fell out of his hands, words were confused. He couldn't remember anything like this with any of his girlfriends. Did it mean what his mother was implying? Edgar didn't know. But each time Edgar waited for Elizabeth to come home from school more and more, and the joy of seeing her was brighter and brighter. Sure, let's go, the girl agreed. Are you sure you can manage without the pram? I have to, Edgar assured her. Good, Elizabeth's voice warmed. Then be ready on Saturday. I'm looking forward to it. Edgar pressed the button too soon, and he wanted to add kisses. But again, that childish embarrassment ruined it. How surprised he'd be to find Elizabeth feeling the same way, standing in the middle of the institute with a phone in her hand. I skipped the lab so I could come with you, Elizabeth blurted out when they were already on the train. Edgar looked at her in surprise. He had decided for the first time not to take the wheelchair with him and to use only crutches. Why? Instead of answering, Elizabeth climbed under his arm and tucked her nose into his side so that Edgar could only see the top of her head. He smiled into the measured, sleepy emptiness of the carriage. closed his eyes, and hugged Elizabeth tighter. The flat Edgar hadn't been to in almost 6 months echoed with the familiar turn of the key and the smell. The man breathed it in, standing on the threshold as if hesitant to enter. The smell reminded him again of times of traveling and flying. His paraglider was in a case in the cupboard on the balcony, his equipment in a rucksack, trekking boots, a camera for taking pictures from a height, a helmet. Amanda's belongings were not in the flat. Contrary to Cassandra's fears, she had taken every last jar, and judging by the footprints in the bathroom, quite recently. She hadn't even bothered to clean up. Edgar and Elizabeth ordered a snack to be delivered and began to tidy up. The man tried to do everything himself, but occasionally he stopped and rested. Elizabeth quickly tidied up the bathroom, washed the dusty dishes, wiped down the cupboards, vacuumed the carpets, and wiped down the mirrors. "You're doing a great job." She praised Edgar as they sat down in the evening on the sofa in the living room with sandwiches and cups of tea. "The doctor was right. You're getting better." "I'm too well motivated," Edgar joked, glancing at Elizabeth. She was embarrassed and dropped the sausage in her lap. "I'm very grateful for everything you do for me." Edgar took a piece from his sandwich and transferred it to the girl's sandwich. "But I am very much attracted to the sky. I want to fly again and do what I love to do. I just don't know how." Edgar frowned. "Aren't you afraid of hurting your back again?" Elizabeth wrinkled her forehead too. She knew what had happened to Edgar's partner and their plane. "Honestly, I'd go through it all again." Edgar looked at her defiantly. "Why?" Elizabeth bowed her head, perplexed. "To meet you again." Edgar leaned down, quickly pulled the girl to him and kissed her. Amanda hurriedly paced across the bridge to the cafe for lunch with her friend. They had just toured a dozen bridal salons looking for a dress for her and her bridesmaids. It was the end of August. All wedding preparations were almost finished. A restaurant had been chosen, a photographer, a designer, and a host had been hired. The menu was determined and invitations to guests were sent out. "Aren't you tired of pretending to be pregnant while sipping cold juice from a tube?" Judy asked. "I am. But what can you do? You want a beautiful life." Amanda grinned. "You've got Michael, I'll give you that," she said dreamily. "Handsome, with money, established. He's got it all. Not like your former test pilot." "You don't say." Amanda nodded, pushing her plate away. "The man's in his 30s, and he's still in the mountains, doing crazy things. It's all right, they're divorced now. Forgotten like a terrible dream." Her friends laughed. "How far along are you?" Judy nodded at Amanda's belly and grinned. "I'm in my 5th month of eating like a madwoman, and I've already gained 3 kilos. How can I lose it all?" "It's okay, 1 more week and you'll have a tragic drama." Amanda grinned. "Where do you get the paperwork from Michael to believe?" Judy whispered. "Camila, my friend, does it for me for a small fee." Amanda replied in her tone of voice. "We should go to her today, by the way. Michael wants the results of the ultrasound. Paul wants to know the baby." She grinned again. "You're a brilliant woman, Amanda." She admired her friend. "I wouldn't dare do that. If you want to live, you have to be able to move." Amanda shrugged her shoulders. The girls paid for their lunch and said goodbye. Amanda got behind the wheel of a brand new red sedan, and John waited for a taxi. In her head, Amanda was already imagining the wedding ceremony, figuring out how her dress would fit, what angle would be best to take pictures from. She ordered an exclusive bouquet of terry pale lilac roses from the florists and anticipated her image with it in such dreams. The girl drove up to the clinic car park. After a small formalities, Amanda was already sitting in the office of gynecologist Camila. The nice conversation was interrupted by a phone call. "Sweetheart, where are you?" Michael answered the phone to greet her. "I'm at my doctor's office. When I get off, I'll pick up the results and go straight home." "Oh, great, I thought I'd make risotto. I asked if you could have it, because there's wine in the recipe," Michael asked worriedly. "Okay, I'll be sure to ask." Amanda jabbed her finger at the screen without looking and slipped her smartphone into her purse. "He's worried about my pregnancy." She wrinkled her nose and made an inverted comma in the air with her fingers. Well, what about you? Camila nodded at the memo for expectant mothers on the office wall. You could really get pregnant, you're already at the right age. And you have a reliable man. As they say, they would have hired a nanny, and you have a child and a status. And you're not poor. What's wrong with that? Amanda wrinkled her nose as if she'd taken a bite out of an unripe persimmon. Are you kidding me? I'm already thinking, how do I lose weight? And if the belly button did grow, there'd be stretch marks, swelling, and a C-section. God forbid. Maybe someday, but definitely not now. It's up to you, but I would not refuse such prospects, Camila grinned. So what do you need? An ultrasound at 16 weeks. I'll look it up. Who I've had recently with the same dates. She sat down at the machine, then back at the computer, and began to look for suitable data. A couple of manipulations to change the date and last name. Soon the required documents were lying in front of Amanda. The girl gratefully slipped them into her bag and moved an envelope to Camila. Have you decided what to wear to the wedding? She asked. Yes, I've looked at a couple of options, the doctor replied. We were discussing your photos. General laughter resounded in the office. Amanda drove home in high spirits. She picked up the wedding glasses from the salon, packed them carefully in a box, and was pulling into the car park of Michael's house by 7 p.m. That's odd. I thought he wanted to make risotto. Amanda turned up her nose, kicking off her shoes in the hallway. The house smelled ordinary instead of Italian. And it was too quiet, no sound of rattling pots, no clatter of knives from the kitchen. The girl went into the hall and saw Michael sitting in the armchair. Did you decide to order food from the restaurant? Amanda tried to joke. Michael looked at her glumly. Give me the car keys. Why? Amanda raised an eyebrow in bewilderment. Michael sucked in air through his nose, exhaled. You're going to give me the car keys, then you're going to go to the first floor. Gather all your things, call a taxi, and get the hell out of my life. His voice rumbled so loudly that it echoed in every corner of the house. Amanda squirmed cowardly, her eyes watering. She tried to open her mouth. Michael, what's wrong? The man stood up and roughly snatched the keys from her, his hands shaking. And tell your doctor I'll make sure she's not allowed to practice medicine. Or better yet, sue her, Michael said coldly, looking her in the eye. Amanda collapsed onto the carpet between the chairs. Her ears rang in her ears as reality rained down on her unprotected skin, burning her with the pain of hot needles. Michael squatted down beside her, took her chin, and turned her to face him. Were you trying to get a warm place for yourself at my expense? I had the wrong time and made the wrong call. Yay. How embarrassing. It was so stupid to think of it, he said with a sneer. Amanda burst into tears of shame. But Michael didn't care anymore. She remembered that night like a blur. She stuffed her things into suitcases and bags in 15 minutes, not even trying to apologize, even though it was pointless. Offended Michael, the director of the real estate agency, made caustic jokes about her, and then he poured himself a glass of wine and drank in silence, watching her ex-lover Amanda frantically packing her belongings. Before he left, he took away all her expensive gifts, watches, jewelry, branded items. Amanda walked out of the gate with exactly the same set of things she'd come here with a few months ago. So are you ready? Elizabeth stood in front of Edgar and held his hands tightly. Ready, my captain, the man mockingly put a hand to his helmeted head. The paraglider takeoff pad spread out before them, and beyond it thundered mountains of unbelievable beauty in the autumn landscape. The slopes were drenched in all the colors of the sun's palette, from ochre to purple. The bushes of wild buckthorn shone with beads of miniature berries. Black thorns did not argue with them with their purple cherry leaves. Gray-brown stones, as if old wise men, soothed the riot of autumn colors. It was the end of September. On the bald slope away from the site, the last emerald lizards basked and rare butterflies fluttered. When you go to land, don't spread your legs too far apart. We'll know when it's time, said Terence, adjusting his harness. Oh, come on. What's the holdup? Thomas, the instructor who had once trained John, peered out from behind the passenger cradle. He won't be flying himself until next season at the earliest. I'm in charge for now. All right, stay out of this." Terrence held his palms up and moved away from the runway with Elizabeth. "Let's go down the incline and I'll pick you up," Thomas commanded John. "Let's go." John gripped the safety harness tighter and sped forward. Elizabeth gasped when the wind caught the glider and it began to rise upwards, swaying weakly. Terrence put his palm to his forehead, shielding his eyes from the sun, and shouted approval. "All right, let's go," Elizabeth agreed. "Good. I'm worried about him anyway." She rubbed her fingers together nervously. "Come on," Terrence patted her on the shoulder. "Thomas is the best of the best. He'll bring your husband back to Earth safe and sound." Elizabeth just looked up at the bright dome of the paraglider, which had already risen even higher. "Let's go to the lower ground." "They'll land there," Terrence nodded to the gangway. "When will you fly?" she asked. "I'll wait until Edgar is fully recovered," Elizabeth replied. "He's the only one I trust. And it's so nice and amazing and beautiful here." She spread her arms and breathed in the still warm, clean air, but with a hint of autumn chill. Terrence laughed. "You haven't been rafting with us or riding quad bikes in the mud. There you can feel all the charms of wild tourism." "I think that everything is still ahead of us," Elizabeth smiled back. "Of course, we will definitely take you with us if you want. First we'll get to work, and then we'll send one on tour with people," laughed the cheerful Terrence again. No. I'm only going with my husband." Elizabeth shook her head. They walked to the lower ground, where they found a thermos of herbal tea and sandwiches in the tents. A lot had changed in Edgar and Elizabeth's lives over the past summer. They sold their flat in the city and bought a smaller place away from the center. And the remaining money was spent on a second-hand minibus in good condition. Terrence did not have to be persuaded for a long time. He was happy to return to the company and to travel to the mountains again. He only demanded a good insurance policy in case of unforeseen circumstances. Elizabeth took over the information part of the company, dealing with advertising, answering the phone and keeping the documentation. Edgar was not yet able to fly as an instructor. He had not yet fully recovered from his injury. But he was happy to tell tourists about the coolest places to visit, gave a copy of his book with an autograph to the most curious. But the biggest change was in Elizabeth and Edgar's relationship. They were now officially married. There was no lavish wedding, no expensive gifts, no typical wedding dress. The newlyweds signed, sat with their loved ones, and drove off to the mountains that same evening. By the time of the wedding, Edgar was already walking with a cane and did not need crutches, much less a wheelchair. The doctors applauded him and called it nothing short of a miracle. "It's so good to be here again, and to have everything back to the way it was." Terrence stretched noisily with a satisfied face. Almost the same old Elizabeth corrected him. "I'm sorry," generously. Terrence made a conciliatory gesture with his hand. Suddenly Edgar's phone, which was still in Terrence's pocket, caught the connection and played a familiar tune, announcing an incoming call. "No, it's not Edgar. He's flying." Terrence deftly retrieved the device and put it to his ear, winking at Elizabeth, who was listening intently to the dialogue. "How does it fly?" "Just like that. He's recovered. So I think the question is irrelevant. He's already married and loves her very much." Terrence put the phone back away. "Who was that?" Elizabeth asked curiously. There's a fallen star." Terrence waved his hand vaguely in the direction. Suddenly he jumped up and shouted, They're flying. Catch it." Elizabeth jumped up after Terrence. The two of them, assisted by Thomas, brought Edgar safely back to solid ground. He was unhooked from the cradle, and the man was sprawled on the grass, arms outstretched, looking up at the autumn blue sky with sparse clouds. "Alive?" Elizabeth asked with a laugh. "As alive as I've ever been," Edgar blurted out, putting his hands behind his head.